Welcome to the drowsy historian. Close your eyes and let's drift into the smoky, stifling world of a medieval noble kitchen, where the fires never stopped burning, and neither did the people. Forget what you think you know about grand halls, golden goblets, or well-fed royalty smiling over roast boar. Behind that feast, behind every shining dish on the Lord's table, was a hidden world of relentless toil, bone-cracking exhaustion, and quiet human suffering. And at the heart of it all was the cook. Let's begin before the sun rises, not in some cozy stone chamber with a fireplace and a morning mug of ale, but down in the castle's lower levels, in a room blackened by soot and sweat. The cook wakes up not to birdsong or bells, but to the aching reminder that today, like every day, he'll be lifting, chopping, scrubbing, and stirring until his arms feel like they'll fall off. He's already sore from the previous day, and he hasn't even started. His hands, thick, cracked, and calloused, no longer feel pain the same way yours might. They're burned from grabbing iron pans without a mitt. They're stiff from hauling water buckets by rope from the well. There's no soap, no breaks. Just bruises, backaches, and blisters. His name may never be remembered. We rarely have records of the people in the kitchen, just the menus. But he was likely a man of low birth, a servant or bonded laborer. Maybe he was born into this job. Maybe he was good with a knife. Or maybe he just didn't run fast enough the day they were recruiting. He begins by lighting the fires. The hearths are massive, sometimes tall as a man, and they need to be kept burning all day long. The castle's kitchen fire is its beating heart, and if it dies, so does the entire household's rhythm. So he stokes the coals, his face inches from the sparks, smoke curling into his eyes. There's no chimney here, not yet. Not in this part of Europe. The smoke just rises up and fills the rafters, then seeps out through gaps in the stone walls. By noon, he'll be coughing black. As he lights the fires, others stumble in behind him, his apprentices. Maybe a scullery maid or the spit boy barely awake, but already at work. Someone's chopping onions, eyes watering. Someone's peeling turnips with a rusted blade. Someone else is sweeping last night's ash into a corner. The spit boy is already turning the massive crank, rotating slabs of meat over the open fire, grease popping violently, sometimes spitting embers that leave little red kisses on his arms. The boy's face is blank. He learned not to flinch. Let's pause here a moment. Let's talk about heat. This is not the warmth of a sunny kitchen where bread bakes and coffee percolates. This is brutal, punishing heat. The kind that wraps around your throat and climbs into your clothes. The kind that makes sweat sting your eyes until you can't see the knife in your hand. And still, they work. One mistake, one dropped pot, one spilled sauce, one piece of undercooked pork, and the noble might rage. He might throw the dish across the room. He might have the cook whipped. Or, worse, dismissed. And dismissal wasn't just unemployment. It was exile from the only place you had shelter and food. It was a potential death sentence. The cook doesn't taste much of what he makes. He can't afford to. The Lord wants delicacies. Spiced eel, roasted heron, almond pastries dusted with sugar from the east. The cook may get a bite of oat porridge if he's lucky. More likely, he licks his fingers to know if the sauce needs more garlic. Speaking of ingredients, let's look at his pantry. Rats dart along the edges of the larder. The salted meat stinks by modern standards, and fresh meat is a gamble. Chickens come with feathers still clinging to their skin, and fish is often already slimy by the time it arrives. But the cook must make it work. He drowns rotten smells in vinegar. He hides spores with cloves, cinnamon, and black pepper, if the noble can afford it. These aren't flavors added for fun. They're masks to keep decay from being obvious. And then there's the hierarchy. A cook doesn't just answer to the lord of the manor. He must please the steward, the lady of the house, the chamberlain, and sometimes visiting clergy or knights with particular dietary rules. He must know who's fasting, who won't eat pork, who expects veal even during Lent, and who will blame him if the bread isn't fluffy enough. So, between preparing meals for 30 or more people, coordinating spit roasts and stews, managing 2 or 3 fires at once, and cleaning his own mess, the cook is also a juggler of politics. He must never speak too loudly, never take credit, never correct a noble's preference even if it's absurd. A cold pie? Of course, my lord. It was always meant to be cold. And it never stops. Breakfast is barely cleared before someone's calling for midday refreshment. And dinner is a production. It can take hours, multiple courses, dozens of dishes, each carried by a procession of servants. The cook isn't at the table, but every plate is a test. He's judged by scent, by flavor, by texture, by presentation, even by the color of a stew. Fail, and he shamus the house. Succeed, and no one says a word. By the end of the day, the cook collapses into a wooden cot in the corner of the kitchen or a nearby shed. He may not even take his apron off. There's no clean clothes waiting. No warm bath. Just the sound of coals dying down, the ache in his knees, and the knowledge that in a few short hours he'll do it all again. And still, he was luckier than the peasant in the fields. He was indoors. He was near food. Sometimes, he even heard music drifting from the great hall above. But make no mistake, his life was not luxurious. It was hot, filthy, painful, and thankless. And it was all done for the comfort of those who never saw the smoke curling beneath the banquet hall floor. Let's continue not with glory, but with grime. As we return to the heart of a medieval noble kitchen, the smells thicken. This isn't the scent of rosemary and sage you might imagine. No, it's smoke-stained wood, damp meat, curdled milk, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of blood from the butchered animals. In winter, the fat hardens on the floors. In summer, it melts and makes every surface slick. Rats and cockroaches scurry near the grain sacks. Flies circle the butter. And still, the cook must prepare a meal fit for the highest of society. There were no gloves, no refrigeration, no hygiene regulations. The rules were simple. Don't kill the Lord with food, and don't waste ingredients that cost more than your yearly wage. Many meats were preserved with salt or hung in open air, and a cook learned quickly how to shave off green edges and keep the rest looking edible. Mold on cheese, scrape it, bugs in flour, sift and bake, spoiled cream, mix it with spices, serve it cold, and call it custard. Food safety was not a concern. It was a gamble. And yet the cook was held responsible for every misstep. If a noble took ill, the suspicion fell not on the poorly kept larder or the months-old venison, but on the cook. Poison was always feared in noble courts. A stomach ache could trigger an inquisition. Many cooks were interrogated. Some were beaten. Others executed, hung or burned without any actual proof. All it took was an accusation. One jealous servant, one noble in a foul mood, one bishop who disliked the gravy. It was a dangerous profession. Not in a dramatic way a soldier or knight faced danger, but in a slow, grinding fashion. The kind of danger that wears you down, that makes your joints ache before you're 30. That leaves burned scars crawling up your arms like vines. And for women, yes, some cooks were women, especially in wealthier homes. The danger was doubled. Harassment was common. Accusations of witchcraft were not unheard of. A woman who made a pie too perfect, bread that rose too well, or who bewitched a guest with her seasoning could face suspicion or worse. Cooks often slept near the kitchen. It wasn't for convenience, it was to prevent theft and fire. Kitchens were the most fire-prone places in the castle. A single stray ember could ignite thatched roofing or dry wood beams. Fires destroyed countless medieval manors, and if the blaze started on your shift, you paid for it with your life. Some castles built kitchens in separate buildings for this reason, but many didn't. So every night, the cook lay awake, listening to the crackling logs, the soft rustle of rodents, and wondering if this was the night it would all go up in smoke. Let's look at the layout of these kitchens. They weren't tiny cottage hearths. Noble kitchens could be vast, with multiple stations. One for roasting meat, one for boiling stews, one for baking. The bread ovens alone could fit 10 loaves at once, and they took hours to heat. The walls were black with soot, the floor slick with grease, and ventilation was nearly non-existent. Chimneys were rare luxuries, and windows, if present, were small slits high on the walls to keep thieves and the cold out. Candles and oil lamps added more smoke to the air. It was like working inside a living chimney. And yet, cooks were expected to perform culinary miracles. A nobleman's pride rested on his ability to host lavish banquets. So the cook became both servant and spectacle creator. Imagine roasting an entire peacock and then reconstructing it with its feathers after cooking, sewing the skin back on, shaping its pose, painting its beak gold. Imagine stuffing a pig with poultry, which itself was stuffed with sausages and fruit. Imagine shaping dough into the likeness of a cathedral or a knight on horseback. It was food as performance, and failure wasn't an option. But none of this brought prestige. Cooks weren't invited to dine with guests. Their names weren't sung by minstrels. They weren't given land or titles. At best, they got an extra ration of wine. At worst, they were dismissed, flogged, or forgotten. One nobleman might keep a cook for a decade. Another might replace his every season. The higher the noble's status, the more impossible his expectations. During war, things got worse. Food supplies tightened. Salted meat ran out. Wheat spoiled. And still, the cook had to stretch what remained boiled bones into thin broth, turn stale bread into pottage, or dress horse meat with onions and hope no one noticed. In times of siege, he might have to cook rats, dogs, or birds caught from the rafters. The nobles might fast for piety, but the cook fasted for survival. And yet, he kept going. Why? Because cooking in some way was power. The cook had knowledge. He understood spices. He managed the stores. He knew every guest's appetite. He knew what time the Lord woke, what wine he liked with his quail, and what dishes made him sick. In a castle full of politics, the cook was invisible, yet essential. He heard things, arguments, secrets, orders barked in haste. He could pass messages. He could withhold food. He could kill if he wished. Of course, most didn't, but the potential made cooks both feared and watched. A trusted cook might be given keys to the wine cellar. A suspicious one might be followed. There are records of lords traveling with their own cooks to avoid being poisoned by rivals. Some kings even tasted their meals only after a servant had survived a few bites. The kitchen was a political arena of its own. And then there were feast days. Christmas, Easter, weddings, coronations. These were nightmares for the kitchen. The number of dishes could double or triple. Dozens of servants might be brought in, including temporary hands who didn't know their way around. Mistakes multiplied. Stress cracked tempers. These events were not celebrations for the cook. They were tests of endurance. Nights without sleep, days of panic, and the entire noble family's reputation rode on what came out of the oven. In the end, when the guests had gone, when the scraps had been picked clean by dogs and the silverware returned to its locked chest, the cook limped back to his straw mat. No applause, no recognition, just silence, smoke, and the unending churn of the castle's appetite. So, if you ever find yourself time traveling to a medieval castle, do not ask to see the Great Hall. Ask to see the kitchen. Peer into the smoke, look at the hunched figures, the blistered hands, the eyes hollowed by firelight. There, you'll find the real story, the one never told in ballads, the one written in sweat and soot. The cook was not a hero. He was not a knight or a bard or a lord, but he was the unseen engine that kept the castle running. And every roasted swan, every sugared almond, every goblet of warm wine passed first through his weary, weathered hands. And that, dear listener, is why it truly sucked to be a cook in a medieval noble kitchen. Chapter 2. Kitchen Nightmares, Rotting Meat, Rancid Fat, and Filthy Food Prep. As we drift deeper into the smoky corridors of castle life, the story only gets worse. Welcome again to the Drowsy Historian, where tonight we descend into the darker corners of medieval cuisine, beyond the glamour of roast feasts and gilded pastries, into a kitchen ruled not by flavor, but by necessity, decay, and desperation. Because long before food was filtered through health inspectors, long before refrigeration and expiration dates, kitchens were battlegrounds against rot and infestation. And the truth, Most of the food served in noble households was teetering on the edge of edible. Let's begin with meat. Meat was the pride of the medieval table symbol of wealth, power, masculinity. But it was also the single most dangerous ingredient in the kitchen. Without refrigeration, fresh meat was a ticking clock. Slaughtered animals had to be processed immediately. Yet even the fastest kitchens couldn't outrun the decay. Pork would begin to spoil within hours in summer. Fowl went gray quickly. Fish had to be cooked the same day if it was truly fresh at all. And yet nobles wanted fish every Friday, meat for every meal, and exotic game whenever possible. So the cook adapted. One technique was heavy salting. Meat was packed in coarse salt until the juices ran out and the tissue turned stiff and dry. Another method was smoking, which gave the food a leathery surface that sometimes concealed rot beneath. Cured meat lasted longer, but it didn't taste fresh, so sauces were born. Rich, spiced, vinegary sauces weren't just for flavor, they were masks. They buried the scent of decay, colored the meat to hide grayness, and dulled the tongue against the sour tongue of spoilage. Still, cooks could only do so much. By the time a shipment of fish reached a castle from a coastal town, it had often gone soft. The phrase stinking fish was not metaphorical. Cooks would soak it in milk or vinegar to draw out the odor. If that failed, they coated it in mustard, garlic, and cloves. You could still taste the rot, but it now competed with enough spice to make you sweat. If a guest complained, the cook might be punished. But more often, the guests simply pretended not to notice. Nobles weren't unaware, they were just used to it. Let's turn to fat. In a modern kitchen, fat is a luxury olive oil, butter, clarified ghee. But in a medieval kitchen, it was also a survival tool. Fat preserved. It extended shelf life. It filled the stomach, but it also went bad. Animal fat was rendered and kept in clay pots. Butter was stored in cellars. Lard was reused again and again, blackened and congealed with bits of whatever had been fried last. There were no filters, no cleaning cycles, no temperature control. Frying something in a reused pot of 6-day-old loose fat. Normal. Did the fat pop and spit and coat the walls in grease? Absolutely. Did anyone clean it? Not until the fire risk became unbearable. Now imagine trying to work in that. The floor is slick. The handles of pots are greasy. The smell thick, smoky, and meat sweet sticks to your skin and your clothes. It gets into your mouth. It clings to your hair. By the end of a day in the kitchen, you don't just smell like food. You smell like rot. And the food prep surfaces, most were made of wood. Not polished, sanded cutting boards, but rough-hewn slabs, full of grooves and splinters. Blood pooled in the cracks. Juice from spoiled fruit seeped in. You couldn't sanitize them. You just wiped with a rag, often the same one used to clean knives, pans, and occasionally a sweaty brow. Cross-contamination was not a concern because the concept didn't exist. You chopped raw chicken, then herbs, then boiled eggs, all on the same board, often with the same blade. And still they cooked on. Cereal grains offered no safe haven. Flour was stored in sacks, but unless tightly sealed, and they rarely were, it attracted insects, weevils, mites, beetles. Cooks would sift the flour through muslin to remove the worst of them. But most infestations weren't discovered until the dough was already mixed. Black specks in your bread. Seasoning, they might say. The smell of mildew in your grain mash? Add honey. Or cinnamon if the Lord could afford it. Milk was another nightmare. It spoiled within hours in the summer, curdling to clumps and souring to vomit-like stench. But milk had to be used for custards, porridges, cheese. So cooks learned to live with it. They skimmed the top, removed the worst bits, and mixed the rest with enough spice or sugar to keep it tolerable. And if the result was lumpy or bitter, they served it cold and called it seasonal. Let's not forget about water. Potable water was unreliable. Cooks avoided it when possible. Broths were safer boiled for hours, sometimes days. Wine and ale were preferred in recipes, not for taste, but because they didn't kill you. And if a pot of soup developed a film, skim it, add more salt, stir hard, and don't tell anyone. Then came the cleaning, or what passed for it. There were no soap pumps. Water was cold. Detergents were made from lye or ash and stung the hands. Pans were wiped with straw or scraps of cloth, sometimes just rinsed and reused. And those same pans were often stored wet, stacked in corners, giving rise to rust, mold, and inevitably vermin. Rats were a constant companion. Every kitchen had them. They lived behind the bread ovens, beneath the storage benches, near the grain bins. Sometimes they chewed into salted meats. Sometimes they drowned in barrels of ale or honey. Cooks learned to keep traps, though rarely effective. Cats helped, but only a little. Most of the time, you learned to accept the sound of tiny feet in the walls. Flies were worse. Summer brought swarms. Meat had to be covered with cloth, but that didn't always help. Fatty cuts glistened in the heat and attracted buzzing clouds. Fruit rotted in minutes. Sauces went sour. Eggs hatched maggots. There were even dishes invented to disguise this decay. Things like spice pottage or sweetmeat stew, thick and brown and filled with strong herbs. Not because they were trendy, but because they were functional. They kept your guests from asking too many questions. And what happened when guests did get sick? Often nothing. Food poisoning wasn't well understood. If someone died, blame might fall on the cook. But if a guest merely vomited or had cramps, it was chalked up to imbalance or a bad hemal day. Nobles might take a tonic or blame the wine. No one questioned the kitchens. They were just expected to function like coal furnaces or horses. If they broke down, you replaced them, not the system, just the people. And so the cook continued day after day, working with ingredients that smelled wrong, looked wrong, felt wrong. But he had no choice. His job wasn't to serve safe meals. It was to serve meals that looked expensive, smelled good from afar, and made the Lord feel powerful. Whether it made anyone sick was secondary. This was not fine dining. It was survival masked in opulence. And the kitchen hidden from the polished silver and silk of the great hall was a battlefield. Not of war, but of rot. Let's continue where the nightmare only thickens. We've talked about the smells, the infestation, and the spoiled food. Now let's step into the real horror. The disasters that happened when medieval kitchens pushed too hard, too fast with too little. These weren't just uncomfortable conditions. They were often lethal. Let's start with a real example. In 1212, a massive fire broke out in the kitchens of the king's court in London. Historians suspect the blaze began when a dripping pan of fat from a roasted ox caught flame and spread to a pile of hay used to clean the floors. Within minutes, the entire kitchen hall was engulfed. Wooden beams collapsed, stone cracked from the heat, and several servants, including the king's assistant cook, died in the flames, trapped behind iron cauldrons and blocked doorways. There were no fire exits and no water buckets prepared. It wasn't an accident, it was inevitable. Kitchens like these were giant tinderboxes. They mixed fire, grease, cloth, and chaos every day and simply hoped the wind didn't turn. Another real horror. In 1385, a noble's feast in Bavaria was brought to a disastrous end when guests began vomiting mid-course. The culprit? A dish of rabbit stew, cooked with spoiled hare meat that had been revived with strong vinegar and left unrefrigerated for several hours while servants waited on a delayed bishop. The cook, a man named Hans, according to court records, was accused of negligence. He was beaten, his fingers broken, and banished from the estate. But what most don't know is this. The meat had been delivered 2 days late. The cellar was too warm, and Hans had begged the steward not to use it. His punishment wasn't for what he cooked. It was for failing to make rot taste like gold. This wasn't unusual. Cooks were held accountable for ingredients they didn't buy, for storage they didn't manage, and for delays they couldn't control. If a nobleman hosted a banquet and the bread was sour, the cook was whipped. If a roasted goose came out dry, the cook might lose a week's pay. If a child choked on a fish bone, the cook could be jailed or, worse, executed under suspicion of assassination. The more important the guest, the higher the risk. But even without disasters, the daily routine was violent. Knives were everywhere. Cleavers the size of bricks hacked through bone and wood alike. Accidents happened constantly. Fingers were sliced, palms punctured, thighs stabbed by falling blades. There were no bandages beyond dirty rags. No disinfectants beyond wine or ash. One infected cut could mean death by fever. And since most cooks worked with wounds anyway, blood in the food wasn't rare. In fact, blood was often used in recipes. Black pudding, blood soup, stuffed tripe, all common dishes. But sometimes that splash of red wasn't from the animal. Cooks also dealt with what today we consider biohazards. Slaughter was often done in or near the kitchen. Animal intestines were cleaned by hand. Heads were boiled for stew. Eyes, tongues, and brains were delicacies, but they came with risk. Parasites, bacteria, and rotten flesh were routine. One wrong incision could spray a cook's face with bile or worse. And still, he had to keep chopping. Then there were the expectations of spectacle. Noble families wanted not just food, they wanted marvels. Like pies filled with live birds that flew out when sliced. That sounds charming until you imagine the prep. Birds had to be sedated, their wings tied, then stuffed under a crust without dying, so they'd escape dramatically when the lid was cracked open. Often, they died anyway. Then the cook had to redo the trick in secret with another batch. This meant catching birds in the yard, drugging them with herbs, and hoping they didn't suffocate. One cook in Bruges was dismissed for failing to deliver this dish with flair. He had trained for weeks, and yet no flair, no job. Speaking of flair, many nobles expected their meals to match their coats of arms or family pride. Dishes shaped like lions, castles, or dragons were common. Colored jellies. Bread dyed with saffron and spinach. Sauces thickened with crushed almonds or breadcrumbs to create glossy illusions. If the colors ran or the gelatin sagged, the cook was mocked. These weren't chefs. They were artists, engineers, and scapegoats rolled into one. No applause. Just silence or scorn. The worst part? Most of this food wasn't even nourishing. Rich sauces hid lean nutrition. Decorative dishes were barely edible, but nobles ate with their eyes. Meanwhile, the cooks and their helpers survived on stale bread ends, boiled vegetable scraps, and weak broth. They went to bed hungry while the waste bins filled with half-eaten venison, untouched pastries, and sucked dry bones. Many noble kitchens dumped leftovers directly into rivers or fields, rather than share them with the poor. Not out of cruelty, but to show power. Feeding the poor was a public act, not a kitchen duty. This meant the cook also had to balance two worlds' excess and scarcity. He handled 20-pound roasts and golden goblets by day, and scraped fungus off barley loaves for his own dinner by night. He poured wine he'd never taste. He carved meat he couldn't afford. He worked in the center of wealth, with an empty stomach. Disease was another silent enemy. Mold grew on walls, under storage benches, and in bread. Spoiled dairy left behind invisible bacteria. Water sources were tainted with sewage. Cooks sometimes reused water from previous dishes, especially for stews. Diarrhea was so common it had its own treatments in kitchen lore. Boil sage, mix with vinegar, sip and pray. But some illnesses lingered. Some didn't leave. Some ended entire kitchen staffs. And always the cook remained, because someone had to feed the house, no matter how many had died the night before. Even religious festivals didn't offer relief. Lent required fasting, no meat, eggs, or dairy, but nobles wanted substitutes. So cooks made faux meat out of pressed nuts, fake cheese from almond milk, fish pies shaped like birds. They weren't just avoiding sin, they were avoiding blame. If a priest deemed the dish too real-looking, the cook could be accused of deception. That meant penance, or worse, public shame. But if the dish was too bland, the noble complained. A tightrope, always. And through all of this, the kitchen itself remained a hellhole. Fires burned at every hour. Meat hung from hooks dripping. Blood slicked the floors. Knives gleamed beside rotting fruit. Rats watched from rafters. Smoke clung to every surface, and grease made everything stick. The cook worked, bled, and slept in the same fog of flesh and flame. And no one upstairs ever saw it. In the end, the noble kitchen wasn't a place of nourishment. It was a place of illusion, of performance, of dangerous improvisation. Behind every banquet was a battlefield of survival, where meals were made not from ingredients, but from desperation, fatigue, and skill sharpened under threat. So next time you picture a medieval feast, remember this. Somewhere, just out of view, a cook wiped sweat from his brow. Taste the saucy nose is one breath away from sour, and praise it will be enough to please a master who will never step foot in the room where it was made. Chapter 3. The Scullery Boy's Curse. Death by Dish Duty. Close your eyes again, and this time we won't follow the cook or the steward. No, tonight we trail someone lower. Much lower. To a boy often no older than 10, whose life revolved around grease, grime, and the endless clang of dirty pans. He's not named in any record, not thanked in any letter, not remembered in any song. Yet, without him, no feast could end. No dish could be served again. No spoon could reach a noble's mouth. He was the scullery boy at the very bottom of the castle's kitchen hierarchy, and his was perhaps the worst job of them all. In a medieval noble household, the kitchen was a brutal ecosystem, and the scullery was its lowest trench. This wasn't a tidy sink or a shallow basin under warm lights. The scullery was usually a dark, damp, subterranean chamber tucked beneath the kitchen, where water ran cold and soap was a luxury. The floor was always wet, the air always thick with the mingled stench of fish bones, spoiled milk, burnt stew, and dishwater left to rot. Rats liked it here. So did cockroaches. It was warm, moist, and full of scraps. And this was where the scullery boy lived. He started his day before the cook. Before the ovens were stoked, before the dough was kneaded, he was hauling water from the well bucket after bucket, each heavy enough to buckle his spine. There were no taps, no pumps, just ropes and pulleys, icy water, and endless trips back and forth. One drop spilled meant one more trip. Then he scrubbed pots, each blackened by fire, coated with sticky fat or crusted barley. If you've ever tried to wash a lasagna pan with burnt edges, imagine doing it with no soap, no sponge, and water that turns cold within minutes. Now multiply it by 30. The boy worked with iron cauldrons so large they had to be dragged, frying pans the size of wagon wheels, platters stained with the dried blood of last night's roast. His tools: twigs, straw, bits of cloth, and coarse sand. Sand was the most common scrubber abrasive enough to strip grease, but also skin. The boy's hands were often cracked, red, raw, fingernails black with grime. No gloves, no oil, no balm. Just cold water and harder scrubbing. And the hours endless. A feast might require hundreds of dishes. Each course came with its own set. The nobles used ornate pewter or even silver, but the kitchen used battered iron and dull tin. While the great hall laughed and drank, the scullery boy crouched on his knees, scraping the remains of gravy off a pot that had already been reheated 5 times. While the nobles clinked goblets, he fished broken glass from the drain. While music played above, he dragged boiling water from the hearth down narrow stairs, burning his thighs as he tried not to spill it. Let's pause there because that boiling water wasn't just a hazard, it was a threat. There are accounts of scullery boys who were scalded when carrying pots too big for their arms. One slip and the water poured down their chests, onto their feet, into their shoes. One boy in 1327 reportedly died after tripping over a dog in the scullery corridor. He was carrying a cauldron of stew back from the fire, and the liquid burned his torso so badly he didn't survive the infection. Another in France was crushed when a heavy pan tipped over while he was cleaning beneath it. There were no safety rails, no first aid, no pause in the work. The dish he was trying to wash was simply handed to someone else. And yet, for all this, the scullery boy was invisible. He didn't get credit when meals went well. He was blamed if the dish came out dirty. If a goblet had a grease smudge or a spoon still carried a whiff of fish, the scullery was punished. Usually him. A kitchen slap. A kick. A full day without food. The cook might say nothing, too tired himself, or he might lash out. Anger rolled downhill, and the bottom was always the boy. What did he eat? Scraps. If he was lucky, a crust of bread dunked in broth. The fat skimmed off meat. The rinds of cheese, if no one had claimed them. Often, he simply worked until collapse, then curled beside the fireplace, where no one would trip over him. His bed might be a sack. His blanket, a torn apron. He slept with soot in his lungs and blisters on his palms, dreaming of nothing because dreaming took energy he didn't have. He wasn't guaranteed a future. Some scullery boys graduated to kitchen assistants or pot boys or rarely apprentice cooks. But most didn't. Most stayed where they were until their backs gave out or a cut got infected or they aged out and were replaced by someone younger. There was always another boy from another poor family ready to work for food and a roof. Let's talk about the filth. The scullery wasn't cleaned, it was cleaning. It was assumed dirty. The walls ran with moisture. Mold bloomed in corners. The floor was often layered with spilled milk, rat droppings, and ash. No one cared. No one mopped. Mopping was what the boy did, not to the floor, but to the dishes. And even then it wasn't truly clean. Pans were scrubbed until clean enough, until the worst of the filth was removed. Sterile wasn't a word he knew. He didn't get to choose what he cleaned. One day it might be the pig bucket, sloshing with offal and bile. Another, it might be the fish tray, crusted with scales and eyes. He'd drag his rag over each, choking on the smell, blinking against the sting of vinegar or wine or fat gone sour. He was always wet, always sore, always too small for the job. Sometimes he had to scrub with ashes, yes, literal ashes from the hearth, mixed with water into a gray paste that worked like soap. It didn't just clean dishes. It scraped skin. After weeks of use, his hands would flake, bleed, and peel. If a cut opened, it never closed properly. Infection was common. Fever too. But unless he collapsed, he was expected to show up. The scullery boy wasn't allowed near the nobles' plates. Only the higher staff could clean those. If the boy dropped one, he might be whipped. If he broke one, he could be imprisoned. In one case recorded in England, a boy who cracked a gold-rimmed plate was beaten by the steward and locked in a cellar for 2 days without food. He was 8, and yet, despite all this, the boy rarely spoke. He didn't cry, there was no point. He didn't rebel, he had nowhere to go. He didn't even beg, because to ask for better treatment meant drawing attention, and attention was dangerous. The best he could hope for was to be ignored. To do his job so silently, so invisibly, that no one noticed he was there. That was the scullery boy's curse. He saw everything, heard the cooks, smelled the meat, tasted the air of banquets he'd never attend, but could touch nothing, claim nothing, and never rise above the floor that scraped his knees raw. The castle's kitchens were built on labor-silent, invisible labor, and at the very bottom of that pyramid was the scullery boy, a living cog in the brutal machine of noble life. If the nobles' guests could eat from shining platters and drink from clean goblets, it was because the boy had already bled, scalded, and broken himself behind the scenes. His job was not glamorous, not rewarding, and never remembered. And yet his work was essential. Without him, the kitchen stopped. Let's look closer at some of the real tragedies recorded across medieval Europe, moments when these small hands paid the highest price. In a chronicle from a 14th century monastery near Ghent, there is mention of a young scullion who drowned in a deep cistern while drawing water during a frost-heavy morning. He had slipped on ice outside the scullery door. The bucket fell in first, he lunged for it, and the chain gave way. His body wasn't found until hours later, floating beneath a layer of ice. The steward reportedly ordered another boy to finish the work before anyone had time to grieve. One dead boy was not enough to halt dinner. In another case, from an English manor house in Devon, a fire started in the scullery during a large feast. The boy had been ordered to reheat a copper pan full of beef drippings over an open flame. Grease had collected at the bottom of the stove for weeks uncleaned, caked in soot. When it caught fire, no one noticed until the entire wall went up. The cook escaped. The boy didn't. He was trapped beneath a collapsing shelf and burned alive. Later, when his mother arrived to collect his body, she was told there was nothing left to bury. These weren't isolated incidents. Scullery boys worked in the most dangerous part of the castle. The fire was always burning, the floor always wet, and the air always smoky. There were knives, axes, boiling oils, and unstable scaffolding all within arm's reach. They had no training, no protective clothing. They learned by doing and by suffering. There were even stories of scullery boys used as punishment. If a lord wanted to humble a page or punish the son of a servant, he might assign him to dish duty for a week. But for some, this wasn't punishment, it was permanent life. Poor families with too many mouths to feed often gave their youngest sons to noble households. The arrangement was simple. The boy would be fed and housed, and in return, he would work. No wage, no education, just labor. For many, it was this or starve. Some boys did try to escape. A surviving letter from a steward in Normandy, written in 1371, complains of a boy who fled during a stormy night. He took with him nothing but his rags, the steward wrote, and yet his absence ruined the morning roast. The letter makes no mention of the boy's name or his fate, only that the kitchen was delayed. To the household, the runaway wasn't a person, he was a function, and when that function failed, it was merely replaced. But among these dark stories, there were rare flickers of defiance. One anonymous account from a traveling friar tells of a boy who, tired of being beaten for slow work, urinated in the broth pot before serving it to the steward who had struck him. The incident caused a scandal, though the boy's identity was never confirmed. Some claim he was executed. Others say he escaped into the countryside. The tale, told in hushed tones among servants for generations, became a legend of tiny, bitter resistance. Even the church weighed in on scullery life. Some abbeys viewed dishwashing as an act of holy humility, assigning it to novices as a form of discipline. But the physical hardship remained the same. In one Benedictine rulebook, monks were advised to rotate scullery work to prevent bodily affliction and permanent infirmity, a subtle admission that the task could damage a person for life. And yet, the role never disappeared. As the Middle Ages wore on, castles got larger, kitchens expanded, banquets grew more lavish. But the scullery boy remained still anonymous, still sore, still at the mercy of the pans he could barely lift. Even into the Renaissance, when kitchen tools improved slightly and architecture allowed for better ventilation, the job's brutality stayed constant. The only change? The scale of the suffering. You might wonder, why didn't anyone help them? Why didn't cooks, who themselves knew pain, protect the scullery boys? Sometimes they did. A few records mention cooks who defended their assistants from abuse. One even took the blame for a broken dish to spare his youngest boy from being flogged. But these were rare gestures. Most were too afraid or too tired. In a world built on hierarchy, solidarity was dangerous. The only way to survive was to keep your head down and finish your work. Even death didn't guarantee dignity. Scullery boys who died were often buried without ceremony. No headstone, no record, just a shallow grave behind the manor or in a pauper's field. If they were lucky, someone might say a prayer. But most were forgotten by the next feast. Their only lasting legacy lives in the language. The word scullery itself lingers in our kitchens. It once referred to the room of grime and clatter, of tears and slop, a place that modern homes try to erase with shiny counters and silent dishwashers. But for centuries, it was the world of the smallest workers, toiling in the darkest corner, scrubbing away the traces of gluttony they would never taste. And so the next time you stand at your sink, rinsing a plate or wiping a pan, pause, think of the scullery boy, of his frostbitten fingers, his blistered palms, the cold air on his soaked boots. Think of how many meals passed through his hands, how many dishes gleamed because of his pain, and how rarely anyone said thank you. Because for every noble banquet you read about, every opulent course served with ceremony and song, there was a boy in the shadows, scraping the crusted remains from the pan, unseen and unheard, yet always essential. Chapter 4. Feast or Famine. Cooking for gluttonous banquets during a famine. As the candlelight fades and we step further into the twisted contradictions of medieval life, let's confront a truth that feels almost too cruel to believe. In a world where entire villages starved, where mothers fed their children weeds and bark, and where winters took more lives than wars, there were still castles where the food never stopped coming. There were tables so heavy with meat, cream, wine, and sugar that the guests could barely stand afterward. Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian, where tonight we walk the thin and shameful line between gluttony and desperation. This is the world of feasting during famine. To truly understand this horror, imagine a year like 1315. It's raining. It's been raining for months. Fields are flooded. Grain stores are rotting. Cattle are dying of disease. In the countryside, peasants boil acorns to make bitter paste. They scrape moss off trees. Some eat grass. Others, too weak to beg, simply die in the mud beside their homes. Historians now call it the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. But in castles across England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, the kitchen still burned. Why? Because the nobility had power and with it, access. They controlled grain, they had connections to merchants. They owned land that wasn't yet soaked. And when they couldn't buy food, they took it. Nobles sent soldiers to seize grain from nearby villages, under the pretense of taxation. They raided monasteries. They borrowed livestock from poorer tenants and never returned it. They hoarded barrels of salted meat, sacks of flour, and wheels of cheese behind locked doors. And when their stores grew low, they simply raised taxes again. So while famine spread to the countryside, within the walls of the Great Hall, banquets continued. Grand ones, elaborate ones, lavish displays of excess, held not in spite of the hunger outside, but sometimes because of it. You see, the noble feast was more than a meal. It was a symbol, a way to display dominance, control, and divine favor. If a lord could feed 50 guests during a food crisis, it showed that he was chosen by God, that he deserved obedience. That suffering stopped at his door. Now let's go to the kitchen, where the cook stands in his usual fog of sweat and smoke, but this time with a twist of guilt. He's been ordered to prepare a 12-course meal, even though he knows that less than a mile away, peasants are digging up roots in frozen ground. He's carving a boar while the village butcher hasn't seen meat in weeks. He's dusting tarts with sugar while the local children are collapsing from hunger. And yet, he works because if he doesn't, he's dismissed. Or worse, accused of sabotage. The pressure is worse than ever. The meat is precious, now hoarded and guarded. If he overcooks a bird, it's a scandal. If he breaks a bottle of imported wine, it's theft. There is no room for error when every ingredient has become political. Some stewards even weigh ingredients before and after cooking, tracking every gram of flour, every drop of oil. A missing turnip can lead to suspicion, accusation, even punishment. Meanwhile, the guests arrive. They're dressed in their best, their winter furs, their embroidered sleeves. The women wear silk gloves. The men drink from gold-rimmed goblets. And as they sit, servants bring in the first course. Roasted quail, perhaps laid on a bed of preserved fruit. Then thick soup, seasoned with saffron and nutmeg. Then a whole goose, carved tableside. The plates never stop coming. Neither does the wine. The room grows warm, full of laughter and music, while just outside the castle walls, silence settles over snow-covered fields where no crops will grow. This isn't fiction. This was daily life during some of Europe's worst famines. During the 1316 famine, records from a noble estate in Picardy show that the kitchen served 340 meals during a single 3-day celebration. Local village reports from the same month mention mass burial pits dug for the poor who had frozen or starved. Let's pause and consider how this affected the kitchen staff, not just emotionally, but practically. Cooks couldn't rely on market deliveries anymore. Grain had to be rationed. Dairy was sour more often than not. Game was hard to find, as desperate poachers had killed off most of the local deer and hare. Even the nobles felt the shortage, though only at a cosmetic level. They complained of smaller birds, less colorful fruit, dull wine. They demanded that the cook make do. And so he did. This gave rise to strange innovations. Fake dishes became common. A meat pie might actually be filled with beans and onions, thickened to mimic texture. Sugar sculptures made from honey and ash. Colored sauces poured over bland root vegetables to make them appear exotic. The feast had to look luxurious, even if it wasn't. It wasn't about taste. It was about illusion. And as the guests gorged, the leftovers piled up. Trays of half-eaten pastries, bones still clinging with meat. Bowls of wasted broth. The kitchen staff wasn't allowed to take these leftovers for themselves, not always. Some nobles ordered all scraps destroyed or dumped into rivers to prevent encouraging theft. Others believed that giving the poor leftover meat would make them lazy. So even waste became a weapon. There are grim tales from this time. In one documented case from Burgundy, a kitchen maid was caught hiding a loaf of bread beneath her apron to take to her starving brother. She was stripped of her position, beaten, and publicly humiliated in the courtyard. Her family was later evicted from their cottage on the edge of the Lord's land. The lesson? Hunger was not an excuse for disobedience. And still, the banquets went on. To the nobles, food was more than survival, it was proof of identity. They were the eaters, the feeders, the chosen. To share food with the hungry was not charity, it was a loss of power. Even when priests urged mercy, even when friars begged for redistribution, many nobles refused. They said, "It is not fitting for men of status to eat as if they were peasants." Meanwhile, back in the kitchen, the staff kept moving. One boy chopped onions with tears of more than just spice. Another girl stirred a pot of stew so fragrant it made her dizzy with hunger, but none of them dared sneak a taste. They worked while their bellies ached and their hearts twisted in quiet shame. Because in the medieval kitchen, even compassion could cost you your job. And so, as winter howled outside, the music inside played louder. The nobles danced. They toasted. They feasted. And in the kitchen, the cook served the final dish, a swan, roasted and reassembled with its feathers posed in flight across the table. A creature that once soared now served to impress guests who never saw the fields. The hunger or the dying eyes of those beyond the castle gate. The paradox of feast amid famine didn't just stain the fields with silence. It echoed across every scrap of parchment, every scribbled recipe, and every whispered rebellion. In the second half of our journey into medieval culinary cruelty, we leave behind the grand hall and turn our gaze toward the written word. The censored kitchens, and the hungry crowds that dared to bite back. Cookbooks in the Middle Ages weren't printed for the masses. They were hand-copied, bound in vellum, and owned almost exclusively by aristocrats and wealthy clergy. Many were less about daily sustenance and more about culinary theater. Collections of dazzling displays meant to elevate one's prestige. But during famine years, even these elite manuscripts betray signs of anxiety. Recipes shift subtly. Ingredients are substituted. Saffron gives way to mustard. Sugar is reduced, and rare meats vanish entirely, replaced with vegetables dressed up to imitate richness. In the Levander, a famed 14th century French cookbook, attributed to Tailvin, we see instructions for creating mock venison from minced liver, bread and beetroot juice molded and cooked to appear like game meat. Another section describes how to color pottage with burnt breadcrumbs and wine dregs to simulate heartier stews. These weren't simply tricks of culinary curiosity. They were survival tactics for cooks under pressure to serve luxury with a larder that could no longer support it. Behind the illusion, the kitchen staff bore the consequences. If the noble noticed the switch, if a dish that looked like swan tasted like pigeon, or if the almond cream was merely watered wheat paste, they could face punishment. Some stewards banned certain substitutions outright. Others forced cooks to perform taste tests before serving to prove their dishes weren't cheated. There were even recorded incidents of cooks being interrogated by noble councils after meals that failed to meet expectations. Not because anyone fell ill, but because the meal did not reflect the house's dignity. But more than substitution, famine brought restriction. During extreme shortages, lords issued internal bans on ingredients reserving butter for high guests, or declaring that no kitchen servant could eat eggs during the Lenten feast weeks. Even more extreme were the waste edicts issued by nobles who wanted to control appearances. These rules dictated that any plate not finished by a guest had to be destroyed, either burned in the fire or thrown into the moat. This was not about cleanliness. It was about control. It sent a message. We have so much we can throw it away. Outside the castle walls, those messages stung. In towns like Norwich, Ghent, and Rouen, local bakeries were ordered to reduce bread sizes while maintaining price, causing public unrest. In 1320, A riot broke out in London after rumors spread that noble kitchens had received a shipment of white flour, while commoners were rationed dry. Bread riots were common throughout Europe, and often it wasn't the nobles who faced the mobs, it was the kitchen staff. In 1351, in the French town of Chalon-sur-Saône, a coat named Thomas Leroux was attacked by townspeople after being seen transporting a cart of roasts from the lord's estate during a local bread shortage. He was beaten, his cart overturned, and the meat stolen. He survived but was left unable to work. Records show he later died in poverty, no longer employable due to injuries. His only crime? Being the visible hand of invisible wealth. Cooks and kitchen workers became symbols of excess, even though they themselves rarely benefited from the food they prepared. And eventually that tension boiled over. One of the most unusual events from this era occurred during the Great Famine of 1316 at the town of Bruges. Local stories, part legend, part truth, describe a baker's assistant who, in desperation, stole a meat pie from a noble kitchen. The lord, incensed, ordered the boy flogged publicly. But something in the crowd shifted. Hunger sharpened resentment to fury. A woman threw a stone. Another pulled a guard's cloak. Soon the crowd swelled into a full riot. The noble fled the town for a week. His granaries were broken open and food distributed. Though he returned with soldiers, the damage to his reputation lingered for years. That event became a warning. Flaunting food during famine had consequences. After that, some nobles began hosting almsgiving feasts, where the lower classes were invited to witness the meal and then receive leftovers. But even these events were often more about performance than generosity. Poor guests were kept behind ropes. They were watched while eating. The food was cold, sparse, and served without cutlery. Still, it was something. Inside the kitchens, the cook's role became more complex than ever. He wasn't just feeding the noble house, he was managing optics. He had to plan meals that would impress guests, satisfy pride, and not incite riots. One burned pie could mean scandal. One missing haunch of meat could be blamed on theft. And one wrong word about food reserves could trigger suspicion or accusation. This tension wore people down. It made the kitchen quieter, harsher. Trust between staff eroded. Cooks were told not to speak about food deliveries. Scullery boys were threatened if they stole scraps. Stewards began to lock pantries. Wine was counted daily. Kitchens became more like vaults than places of nourishment. And those who worked within them, especially during famine, lived in a state of constant surveillance. Even spiritual comfort was thin. The church preached compassion, but many monasteries themselves hoarded food during famines. Wealthy abbots dined well while the hungry knelt at locked gates. The kitchen, sacred in scripture as a place of bread-breaking and shared meals, became a battlefield of exclusion and inequality. And yet, despite all this, the meals continued. Guests arrived. Music played, the fire was stoked, the platters gleamed. It was as though the famine did not exist until the castle windows were closed and the doors bolted shut. Then the cook exhaled. The boy stirred his sixth pot of barley mash, and somewhere beyond the walls, another family buried their last child. This was the horror of feast during famine, the lie of plenty in a world of nothing. It wasn't just the food, it was the silence around it, the refusal to acknowledge suffering, the belief that hunger was deserved, while gluttony was divine right. The medieval kitchen was many things, hot, harsh, dangerous, but during famine, it became a mirror, a distorted reflection of a world where some died scraping bark, while others chewed roast duck and wiped their mouths with lace. Chapter 5, The Spit Boy's Hell, Turning Meat on a Death Machine. As we sink deeper into the underbelly of medieval kitchens, the fires grow hotter, the air thicker, and the suffering more precise. Tonight, on The Drowsy Historian, we place our gaze not on the head cook or steward, but on a figure so low and yet so crucial to every noble meal that the feast could not begin without his endless motion. A boy, often no older than 7, tasked with one duty, to turn the spit, hour after hour, day after day. Rain or frost, feast or famine, the meat had to turn. He was called the spit boy or turnbroche, and if the scullery boy lived in filth, The spit boy lived in fire. To understand his torment, we must begin with the machine itself, the roasting spit. In noble kitchens, meat wasn't just boiled or stewed, it was roasted, a cooking method reserved for the upper class due to its resource demands. A whole pig, a string of fowl, even an ox for special events, all would be skewered on iron spits, several feet long and suspended over blazing fires built large and hot enough to scorch the stone walls. These spits had to turn constantly. If the meat was left too long on one side, it burned. Too short, and it remained raw. There was no automation, no crank-driven gears, just muscle. And that muscle was usually the arm of a child. The boy stood beside the fire, feet planted on greasy stone, sweat clinging to his skin before the day's first dish had been served. His task was both simple and endless. Keep the spit turning. A full roast might take 6 hours or more. Longer in winter, longer still if the noble requested multiple animals at once. The boy turned the rod slowly, evenly, without rust, while waves of heat blasted his face and flames licked dangerously close to his legs. There were no safety standards. His clothes might catch embers. His shoes, if he had any, melted from proximity. One slip of the wrist, one moment of fatigue, and the meat would tilt, collapse, or catch fire. A ruined roast was a serious offense. If it fell into the ashes, it wasn't simply waste. It was seen as a dishonor to the household. The boy could be slapped, flogged, or dismissed. And dismissed didn't mean sent home. It meant removed from the kitchen and returned to hunger. To stay awake, some boys were allowed to chew mint or ginger root. Others had their cheeks slapped by senior staff if they nodded off. But even that wasn't enough. In larger estates, the position of spit boy was considered so essential that it was often doubled one boy for the morning, one for the evening shift. Not for fairness, but because no single child could last a full day without collapsing. And yet, the smallest households didn't have that luxury. There, one boy worked both shifts. Some cooked sitting down, turning the iron with their foot while trying to shield themselves with a piece of wet cloth. Others had to rotate between 2 or 3 spits, dashing between each one, turning a crank or twisting by hand, always under pressure. Their skin blistered, their eyes stung, their backs arched from leaning toward the fire, and yet they dared not pause. Meat was gold. And gold had no mercy. In wealthier castles, the spit boy didn't just turn meat, he ran inside a treadmill. Yes, an actual wheel. Think of a large wooden hamster wheel, mounted horizontally or vertically, rigged to turn the roasting spit above the hearth. The boy was placed inside and ordered to walk. His motion rotated the spit outside the wheel. This may sound ingenious, even mechanical, but in truth it was torture. These wheels were boiling hot, usually placed high in the hearth, so close to the fire that the boy inside inhaled smoke constantly. The wood beneath his feet could burn his solace. There was no escape unless someone stopped the mechanism from outside. If he stumbled, the meat jerked. If he slipped, he was injured. One record from a French estate in 1439 mentions a boy who fainted mid-shift and tumbled within the wheel. His leg broke in 3 places. The Lord docked the cook's pay for the inconvenience. Sometimes nobles tried other tricks. A few households replaced boys with trained turnspit dogs, small, sturdy breeds trained to run the wheels. But these dogs were expensive, hard to breed, and often didn't survive long under the heat. So more often than not, they went back to using boys. Disposable, abundant, obedient. And what of the smoke? The kitchen chimney wasn't always effective. Especially in Northern Europe, where kitchen fires were massive but ventilation poor, the room would fill with thick, greasy smoke by mid-morning. The spit boy closest to the fire inhaled most of it. He coughed constantly. Some developed wheezing lungs before the age of 10. Others began spitting blood, too afraid to say a word for fear of being replaced. Their arms ached from repetition. Their hands blistered from gripping hot metal, and yet they kept turning. If they dropped the handle, the meat sagged. If it sagged, the fat didn't drip correctly. Roasting was about control, not just of the fire, but of the angle, the distance, the drip. Rich households measured everything. How many drips per minute? How evenly the bird turned? The boy was the motor, and if the motor failed, the feast failed. He worked while others prepared vegetables, set tables, or poured wine. No one spoke to him unless to correct him. He didn't learn recipes. He didn't taste the food. He didn't sit near the cook's fire. He sat by the main one, the inferno, where the only thing roasted harder than the meat was his own body. And yet, some of these boys had dreams. A few hoped to be cooks someday. They listened when the cook muttered about spices or roasting times. They watched how the knives were sharpened. They memorized the way glaze was brushed on pork skin to make it crackle. But few were given that chance. Their job was too menial, too low, too essential. They weren't allowed to move upward. They were rotated in and out, replaced like kitchen tools, broken by heat before they ever saw the inside of the pantry. Their parents, usually laborers, tenant farmers, or debtors, were often grateful. After all, the castle gave them food, shelter, maybe a place to sleep. What they didn't see was the scarring, the nightly coughing, the burns that never healed, the way the boy's hands curled unnaturally from years of turning, the way his shoulders sloped before puberty, the way he flinched at even the smell of smoke. For those who survived, their bodies carried the kitchen forever. One chronicler describes a former spit boy in old age whose hands could no longer open to the sky. Another writes of a man whose back had bent so far from leaning toward the fire that he could no longer sleep lying down. In the end, the spit boy was the embodiment of medieval culinary cruelty, sacrificed not for survival, but for spectacle. The noble didn't need a roasted peacock. He wanted one. The boy turned the meat to make it shimmer, sizzle, impress, and no one saw the sweat on his brow or the pain behind his forced silence. Let's return now to the fire, because it never went out. The life of a spit boy wasn't just grueling, it was dangerous and often deadly. And unlike the noble who sat at the head of the table, or the steward who barked orders from a cool corner of the kitchen, the boy was locked in a ballet with heat, fatigue, and fear that never took a breath. Tonight, we dive into the recorded truths, the accidents, and the moment a spit finally stopped turning, it didn't start again. Among the earliest documented cases of spit boy injury is a kitchen record from York. Dated 1303, it describes a boy, no more than 9, whose tunic caught flame while standing too close to the hearth. The cooks rushed to beat out the fire, but not before it had seared both legs below the knee. He survived, but he never walked without a limp again. The record closes coldly. Another boy brought in from village. Work resumed by sunset. No name, no burial. Just replacement. Another chilling account comes from a noble feast in Prague. During the winter of 1389, the fire had been burning for more than 10 hours in preparation for a visiting bishop. 2 whole deer were on the spit, and the boy, exhausted, dehydrated, and slightly fevered, collapsed in place. His hand slipped from the crank, and one of the spits tilted, sending half a stag rolling into the flames. The meat blackened instantly. The feast was ruined. In front of the kitchen staff, the Lord ordered the boy's head shaved as a mark of disgrace. Witnesses say he was later sent to a monastery to atone. The rest of his fate is unknown. There are even darker whispers. Some castles use the spit boy as a scapegoat for kitchen sabotage. If a noble fell ill after a feast, whether from spoiled goose, undercooked meat, or simple indigestion, someone had to answer. The cook was too valuable. The steward too connected. The spit boy, he was perfect. Small, powerless, replaceable. It didn't matter that he never touched the seasoning or the sauce. It didn't matter that he only turned the metal. In 1417, a turnbroche was hanged in Flanders for culinary treason. His only crime was being at the fire when the Baron vomited. Some boys incredibly tried to rebel. In a private letter from a cook in 5th-10th century Burgundy, we read of a boy who stopped turning the spit mid-roast and refused to continue unless given food. The cook, stunned, threatened to beat him. The boy remained still. His eyes were hollow but hard. The cook wrote, "He would not move, I feared for the meat." Eventually, a servant brought the boy a bowl of broth. He ate in silence, then resumed work. The cook ends the letter with a line that speaks volumes. "He frightened me. He should not have known how to fight." But most did not resist. Most were too tired, too hungry, too afraid. They turned to spit with the mechanical calm of someone who had never known rest. When asked to double the shift, they said nothing. When burned, they bit their lips. When beaten for falling behind, they whispered apologies, even through tears. The kitchen demanded obedience, and obedience meant survival. Spit injuries weren't always from fire. The equipment itself was crude and heavy. The iron rods were rough and jagged, often rusted or warped. The crank handles splintered. Some had sharp metal teeth. More than a few boys lost fingernails trying to grip the spit in cold weather. Others cracked bones when a heavy roast shifted and the counterweight fell. In one recorded instance from a Tuscan estate in 1374, a spit dislodged and collapsed on the boy's shoulder. The resulting fracture left his arm twisted. He was dismissed the next day with no payment. The spit boy also bore the emotional weight of silence. He worked closest to the cooks but was rarely spoken to. His job was too low, too simple. No one asked his name. No one trained him. He wasn't a future chef. He was a wheel inside the machine. His job wasn't to learn or improve, only to endure. And there were no seasons off. Winter made it worse. In cold months, the fire was hotter, built higher to combat frost. The air was full of smoke. The floor grew slick with ice from spilled water and animal fat. The boy's clothes were damp constantly. His hands cracked. His breath turned shallow. But the meat still had to turn. Then came feast days, Christmas, Epiphany, Easter. Days of religious devotion upstairs and torture downstairs. A holiday for the nobles meant double or triple roasts, simultaneous spits, synchronized service. The boy might have to turn 2 different meats, each needing a different pace. Timing was everything. Too slow on the boar and the crackling failed. Too fast on the duck and the fat sprayed into the fire. The cook screamed. The steward swore. And still, the boy turned. Did anyone care? Occasionally. A few kind-hearted cooks left bread crusts beside the spit. A scullery girl might sneak him water. But these were rare acts in a system designed to ignore him. The kitchen rewarded silence, speed, and survival, not suffering. Not humanity. And yet his presence mattered. Nobles didn't know it, but the success of their most opulent dishes, roasted swan, golden pheasant, spiced venison, depended on that boy. On his steadiness, on his discipline, on the aching, blistered hands that turned slowly, evenly, under a fire that could kill. In some castles, a boy was chosen as turnbroche at age 5. By 12, he was already being replaced. Used up. His hands too stiff. His eyes too smoke-worn. He was sent away. Sometimes to the fields, sometimes to the streets, sometimes to the grave. His name never entered the records. His labor never carved into stone. But every castle meal bore the ghost of his toil. And so the next time you hear about a medieval banquet, a grand hall glowing with torchlight, golden platters of roasted beasts, noblemen laughing with wine-stained lips, remember the boy in the fire shadow. Remember the soft click of the crank, the quiet cough in the smoke, the burn that never healed. The boy who kept the feast turning while the world forgot to look. Chapter 6, Segment 1, Poison and Paranoia. The cook who knew too much. In the long corridors of power, nothing was more feared than the hidden threat. Daggers could be seen, soldiers prepared for the poison. It crept silently through silver goblets and steaming platters, arriving with the appearance of generosity and the taste of delight. And who stood closer to this danger than anyone else in the castle? Not the knight, not the guard, not even the steward. It was the cook, the quiet hands behind the feast. The one who touched every bite before it reached a noble's lips. Welcome back to The Drowsy Historian, where tonight we uncover the dark truth about medieval kitchens. They weren't just places of fire and food. They were potential crime scenes, filled with suspicion, secrecy, and sometimes revenge. By the 12th century, poison had become one of the most feared and effective weapons in Europe's aristocratic power games. It required no army, no duel, no open confrontation. And best of all for the conspirator, it left few visible traces. One meal, one moment of distraction, and a rival could collapse at the table, choking or shivering. his mouth foaming as the feast continued around him. It was clean, quiet, and terrifying, which meant the cook, who controlled access to every roasted bird, every salted stew, became both a powerful tool and a suspected threat. Paranoia infected nearly every major household. Kings and dukes hired official tasters, not just servants, but trusted retainers who sampled each dish before it was served. Some nobles wouldn't eat unless their food was prepared in front of them. Others kept their own private kitchens, far from the main staff, guarded by men with swords. In royal courts, it was not uncommon for 3 or more layers of personnel to be involved in food service. The cook, the server, the cupbearer, the taster. Each had to be watched. Each could be bribed. And the cook, he was caught in the middle, trusted enough to handle ingredients, feared enough to be watched constantly. In the eyes of his master, he was both servant and suspect. Imagine this. A nobleman begins to suffer cramps after dinner. His lips swell. His skin fleshes. He staggers away from the feast, vomiting. The hall falls silent. The steward turns to the kitchen, not to the wine cellar, not to the bread maker. To the cook, suspicion burns faster than the fire. The noble's physician examines the remains of the dish. Nothing obvious. But no one cares. The cook is summoned, questioned. If he stutters, if he sweats, if he fails to account for a single spice, he's guilty. Sometimes he's thrown in the stocks. Sometimes he's flogged. Sometimes he's executed before the truth is even known. A chilling account from Florence in 1376 details the execution of a cook named Matteo, who was accused of attempting to poison a rival bishop's meal. He claimed he had used wild mushrooms he had gathered near the river, unaware they were toxic. No one believed him. He was tortured, made to confess, and hanged. Months later, the bishop's apothecary admitted to duress that he had tampered with the wine. Matteo's name was never cleared. This wasn't rare. Poisoning wasn't just feared, it was political. Accusations of poisoning were used as weapons themselves. A noble who wished to rid himself of a cook or frame a rival could simply plant the idea that food had been tampered with. With no forensic science, no autopsies, and little medical understanding, there was almost no defense. The cook was always guilty until proven otherwise. Even royal cooks lived in fear. In the court of King John of England, a cook named William was once jailed for over a year after a guest fell ill during a banquet. No charges were ever brought, no poison ever found. But suspicion alone was enough to strip him of his livelihood and freedom. When he was finally released, he was barred from entering any noble household again. The result of this fear: silence. Cooks learned to keep their heads down, to speak little, to share less. Recipes became guarded secrets. Spice blends were hidden. Some cooks developed codes to write down their instruction symbols in place of ingredient names, or deliberate omissions, so no one could replicate their dishes without their help. It was a form of protection, a way to stay useful, indispensable, because being irreplaceable was safer than being disposable. In some households, cooks weren't allowed to leave the grounds without permission. In extreme cases, they were confined to the kitchen quarters entirely. At Chateau de Vincennes in 5th-10th century France, the kitchen staff was literally locked inside during meals, only released when the last dish was cleared and the master declared himself well. It was said that the cook there, a man named Henry, did not see the outer gardens for 7 years. And still some cooks did poison, out of revenge, out of desperation, or simply because they were ordered to. In the shifting sands of medieval court politics, a cook might be bribed to alter a dish, not to kill, but to sicken, to embarrass, to weaken a guest just enough that they miss a key negotiation. If caught, the cook might be promised protection. If exposed, he was swiftly silenced. One tale, recounted in a 14th century Flemish ballad, tells of a cook who poisoned the meat pie of a visiting nobleman on the orders of his lady, his own mistress, who wanted to prevent a forced marriage. The nobleman survived, but the scandal erupted. The lady was placed under house arrest. The cook, drowned in the river. No trial, no appeal. Fear of poison changed everything about how food was handled. Stewards began to inspect storage daily. Herbs were cataloged. Spice merchants were questioned. Even kitchen layout changed. Some castles added safe rooms for food prep, windowless cells where trusted meals were made under guard. The kitchen, once chaotic but open, became more like a fortress. Every pot watched, every hand doubted. And so the cook lived in a constant state of tension, respected for his skill, yet feared for his proximity to power. One wrong move, one stomachache, one petty grudge, and his life could end with a noose, a knife, or a fire. The kitchens of medieval Europe were full of sharp edges and searing flames, but perhaps no force burned hotter than fear, especially when it came to poison. In this second segment, we go deeper, peeling back the layers of real events, scandalous rumors, and infamous cooks who, for better or worse, became entwined with the most dangerous weapon in the medieval arsenal. A meal turned fatal. Let us begin with a story whispered through the corridors of 15th century Naples, where the court of King Ferdinand I lived in such constant fear of poison that his entire culinary staff was rotated weekly. Each cook was sworn to secrecy, searched daily, and forbidden from interacting with guests. Even their family members were monitored. This paranoia wasn't groundless. In 1468, during a royal feast, a visiting ambassador collapsed moments after tasting a roasted partridge. The blame fell instantly on the head cook, a man named Ruggiero, well known for his artistry with sauces. He was seized, tortured, and imprisoned, only for it to be discovered later that the ambassador had suffered a fatal stroke. Ruggiero, who had served the crown faithfully for over 20 years, was never released. But not all cooks were innocent. Some did kill, quietly, deliberately. In 1347, in the German Duchy of Saxony, the cook of a minor noblewoman reportedly poisoned her rival's stew with powdered monkshood. The rival died hours later. Though suspicion fell on the servants, it wasn't until years afterward, when the cook lay dying of fever, that he confessed to the deed, reportedly saying, "She asked me to cook her vengeance. So I did." Whether it was truth or a fever dream fantasy, the story spread quickly, and every noble household tightened its grip on the kitchen. In Venice, the merchant courts were no better. The famed house of Ziani employed a cook named Paolo, who was later accused of feeding tainted food to a rival's envoy during trade negotiations. The envoy survived, but barely. Paolo vanished the next night. His body was found days later in the Grand Canal, his tongue cut out, his hands tied with kitchen twine. Whether he was guilty or merely convenient is lost to time. But his fate was a warning to every cook who dared taste too much power. As this fear gripped Europe, a new role emerged in noble courts, the food taster. Often a servant, sometimes a squire, the taster was expected to sample everything: meat, wine, bread, before it was brought to the noble. At face value, it seemed like a safeguard, but in truth, it was often theatrical. Many poisons didn't act instantly. Arsenic could take hours. Belladonna might show symptoms after the meal had ended. Some herbs were slow-acting, designed not to kill immediately, but to weaken over days. So the taster's presence offered little true protection. Still, cooks had to work under the taster's shadow. Every dish they prepared was scrutinized twice, once by the palate of the taster, and once by the suspicions of the court. And when something went wrong, the blame still returned to the cook. The logic was brutal. If a meal killed, someone must have planned it. And who else had touched every spoonful? This led to some kitchens adopting absurd rituals. In one Bavarian castle, the cook was made to eat from the same dishes as the noble, just from a separate plate. In Hungary, it was recorded that a nobleman would force his cook to eat after the meal. And if the noble felt ill later that night, he'd send guards to check if the cook had also fallen sick. If he hadn't, it was proof of foul play. The idea that the noble's gout or indigestion might be natural was rarely considered. Let's not forget the role of the apothecary, who often stood at the edge of the kitchen with his box of herbs and powders, ready to offer remedies, but also quick to claim that any culinary mishap was alchemical sabotage. In courts where science and superstition mingled freely, even a hint of an unfamiliar spice could trigger suspicion. Foreign herbs, like nutmeg or galangal, rare and expensive, could be viewed as exotic luxuries one moment and toxic threats the next. Because of this, cooks began to write less. Many recipes were kept in their heads, passed orally, hidden. Some even altered their dishes slightly during important feasts, using fewer herbs or blander ingredients simply to reduce the chance of being accused of tampering. If the food was too flavorful, too spicy, too unusual, it raised eyebrows. A dull pie was safer than a dazzling one. Yet there were exceptions. In the court of Duke Ludovico Sforza of Milan, his head cook, a man known only as Aldo, was rumored to have developed immunity to several common poisons by ingesting them in microdoses over years. Whether this is true or court gossip, Aldo was said to taste all his own dishes and survive 3 separate poison investigations. He was eventually knighted not for valor, but for loyalty in the kitchen, a cook knighted. A rarity beyond belief. Of course, the paranoia surrounding cooks wasn't just rooted in food. Cooks knew things. They heard conversations between stewards and squires, saw which guests arrived unannounced, witnessed who dined alone and who sent trays back untouched. They knew which cup had been switched, which guest refused the wine. In the silence of service, they gathered more intelligence than most spies. Some nobles recognized this. Some feared it. And so, cooks were sometimes bribed, threatened, even blackmailed. A kitchen servant might be approached by a chamberlain and asked to serve a specific dish at a specific time. A plate might be marked with a notch. A wine goblet dusted slightly before the feast. And if the cook refused, they risked being accused of conspiracy regardless. Sometimes silence was complicity. Other times it was survival. Perhaps the most haunting example comes from an anonymous Latin letter preserved in a monastery in Hainaut. It tells of a cook who served a feast to his master, knowing full well that the meat was poison, not by his own hand. But by the steward he said nothing. The Lord died. The steward rose in power. The cook kept his position. Years later, racked with guilt, the cook donated his wages to the church and vanished into the countryside. "I did not mix the cup," he wrote, "but I did not tip it over either." That is the tragedy of the medieval cook. Close enough to kill, yet powerless to stop it. Suspected, yet rarely guilty. Feared, yet unarmed. They stood between life and death at every meal. Hands steady, eyes quiet, heart racing, because one wrong flavor could mean ruin. Chapter 7, Segment 1. The Meat Monopoly. When nobles banned you from eating well. In medieval Europe, what you ate said everything about who you were. Not just your class, but your identity, your worth, your place in the grand, grinding machine of feudal life. It wasn't merely about hunger or taste, it was about control. And no food revealed this more clearly than meat. Welcome back to The Drowsy Historian, where tonight we explore how access to meat, how much, what kind, and who could eat it, was strictly regulated, enforced, and, for most people, entirely forbidden. Let's begin with a bleak truth. If you were a commoner in 13th or 14th century Europe, you probably didn't eat meat more than a few times a year, and not because there wasn't enough of it. There were pigs, cows, geese, chickens, and deer in abundance, especially near noble estates. But because the law, the land, and the very structure of society ensured that meat was hoarded by those in power, meat wasn't just food. It was a symbol of dominance. At the top of this pyramid sat the nobility and clergy. They dined on roast venison, glazed duck, stuffed goose, beef stews thick with marrow, and pies filled with pork, mutton, or exotic game. And they did so in grand halls with silver platters, while servants carried trays of flesh through smoky kitchens. Meanwhile, the peasant who raised the pigs often went without. He might be allowed to keep a small portion after a slaughter, but the best, the ribs, the loins, the organs, were taken for the Lord. This wasn't just tradition. It was enforced through law. Enter the sumptuary laws, a series of legal codes passed throughout Europe from the 13th century onward, designed to control consumption based on class. These laws dictated everything from clothing to table settings, but food was one of their central obsessions. In England, a 1336 law under Edward III explicitly limited what non-nobles could serve at feasts. A knight might be permitted to serve 3 courses, a yeoman 2, a laborer, bread and ale, no meat, and definitely no game. Why such obsession over food? Because in a world where visual wealth mattered and where most people lived in grinding poverty, food became a way to draw boundaries. If a merchant grew rich and began eating like a noble, he was seen as a threat. If a cook prepared a boar's head for a burgher's wedding, the local lord might have him arrested. These weren't rare events. In Florence, fines were regularly issued to non-aristocrats who purchased excessive quantities of meat, even if they could afford it. The issue wasn't economics. It was hierarchy. And so meat became a weapon of control. Let's walk through a peasant village during a feast day. You smell the scent of pork fat, of spiced stew, of sizzling duck skin. But it's not coming from your home, it's drifting from the manor. The Lord is celebrating, and his table groaned under platters of meat. But for you, the feast means perhaps a thick oat pottage with some dried herbs, maybe a drop of broth from the bones. If you're lucky, you might be allowed some blood pudding made from leftover animal parts. But the real meat, it's locked away. Literally. Some estates kept meat under guard in separate pantries, inaccessible to the common kitchen. Sometimes even the animals themselves were off limits. Forest laws, especially in England and parts of France, prohibited commoners from hunting deer, boar, or even rabbits on noble lands. These animals belonged to the aristocracy. Hunting them was theft, often punishable by blinding, mutilation, or death. One documented case from 1328 tells of a man in Nottinghamshire who was hanged for trapping a deer with a snare. His wife later testified that he had caught it to feed their starving children. But starvation didn't matter to the law, because feeding yourself wasn't the point. Obedience was. Even raising animals could be restricted. In some villages, peasants needed permission to keep pigs or chickens. If they raised too many, they could be accused of overstepping their station. If a pig grew too fat, it might be claimed by the lord under right of first pick. And if a cow wandered into the noble's pasture, the animal could be seized, slaughtered, and the meat taken, no compensation. The idea behind this was deeply feudal. Land equaled power, and only those born into land ownership deserved the fruits, literally and figuratively, of that land. Meat was not just nourishment, it was a display of control over nature. To roast an animal was to show mastery over the world, and only nobles were deemed worthy of that mastery. This tension often boiled over. Throughout the late Middle Ages, there were countless minor uprisings centered around food. In 1377, a group of French peasants raided a noble's estate during a wedding and stole an entire spit of lamb being cooked outdoors. The noble demanded the village surrender the thieves. The villagers refused. What began as a stolen meal turned into a regional rebellion. It was crushed within weeks, but it left a mark. The records show that after the uprising, the nobles' kitchens were ordered to be relocated farther from the manor gate away from the public eye. Because that's what meat did. It reminded people of what they didn't have. The smell alone was enough to spark fury. Inside noble kitchens, cooks were expected to enforce these divisions. If a servant was caught sneaking scraps to a starving family, he could be flogged or fired. If a kitchen girl was seen passing a slice of cured ham through the window, she might be banished from the estate. And the cook, if he allowed meat to go missing, could be ruined, so they guarded it. They locked storerooms, counted ribs and sausages, measured soup pots. A kitchen wasn't just a place of creation, it was a vault, a bank, and the currency was fat, flesh, and salt. And still, some cooks rebelled in small, silent ways. A thicker stew on a Sunday. A forgotten cut of pork slipped into the servant's meal. An extra bone added to the soup bowl of a sick child. These gestures, though tiny, carried immense risk. Because the line between generosity and treason in a medieval kitchen was often only one bite wide. As we continue our journey through the twisted reality of food control in medieval society, We now turn from the laws of the land to the mandates of heaven, or rather, how the church, too, became an enforcer in the politics of hunger. Because in the Middle Ages, eating wasn't just regulated by kings and lords. It was regulated by God, or so they claimed, and nothing bore the weight of religious authority more than the rules around meat. Throughout medieval Europe, the church imposed strict dietary restrictions based on the liturgical calendar. Fridays were meatless. Lent, which lasted for 40 days, forbade not just meat, but dairy and eggs. There were other fast days, dozens, depending on region and year. For commoners, these restrictions were difficult, but manageable. After all, they rarely had meat anyway. But for the wealthy, these rules collided with luxury, creating a bizarre tension. How to obey God while still eating like royalty. The solution? Exploit loopholes. Noble kitchens became masters of culinary deceit. Cooks created dishes that resembled meat, but technically weren't. Almond cheese. Fish molded into bird shapes. Pastries filled with vegetable mash, but spiced like pork. One infamous recipe from a 14th century French manuscript instructs cooks how to construct roast beef using smoked eel, red wine, and oil-soaked bread, shaped, dyed, and charred to resemble beef. It wasn't about flavor, it was about maintaining the illusion of privilege while checking the theological box. But even with tricks like these, meat remained a sore spot, especially when it was hoarded, smuggled, or forbidden, because the church didn't just encourage fasting, it enforced it. Monks patrolled villages, and some clergy were granted power to inspect kitchens. They could fine households or entire towns if meat was found being prepared during prohibited times. And cooks, again, were caught in the middle. There are records of cooks being publicly whipped for boiling bones during Lent. In the Diocese of Rouen in 1391, a kitchen boy was excommunicated after admitting under confession that he had snuck scraps of beef stew to a visiting minstrel. During Holy Week, he was 11. The priest overseeing the matter wrote in his ledger, "Let it be known that the devil stirs the pot when meat bubbles during God's silence." Even more bizarre were the dispensations, special permissions given to eat meat, usually reserved for the sick or elite. Nobles would pay hefty sums to local bishops for the right to eat for strength during fasting seasons. This created a two-tiered system. The poor starved in piety while the rich feasted under divine permission. And once again, the cook had to manage the optics. Dishes served under dispensation were often hidden. Curtains were drawn in dining halls. Kitchen boys were sworn to silence. But what about those who refused to follow the rules? Meat smuggling became surprisingly common. Salted pork and smoked sausages, cured in secret and hidden in sacks of grain or bundled cloth, were sold behind churches in shadowy alleys or by traveling merchants. Some cooks maintained contact with these networks, especially those serving wealthier merchants or minor nobles who couldn't afford both respectability and indulgence. A sack of contraband bacon could cost a month's wage, and if caught, the punishment wasn't a fine. It was humiliation. A documented case from Cologne in 1423 describes a cook named Elspeth, who was accused of preparing veal during a fasting day for a city councilman. She was paraded through the streets with a cow's stomach tied around her neck, then made to kneel before the cathedral for an entire day while holding a pig's foot in each hand. Her employer paid a fine. She never worked in a kitchen again. For many cooks, this was the tightrope. Feed the appetite of your master while dodging the wrath of both state and church. Say no, and you were replaced. Say yes, and you risked public shame or worse. And yet, beneath these restrictions, hunger remained. In cities, meat markets were tightly controlled. Guilds decided pricing and availability. Only certain butchers could slaughter livestock, and only approved vendors could sell cuts to households. Even then, the best pieces went to those with connections. For everyone else, the scraps remained: trotters, fatback, cartilage, and still, prices rose. In London, by the mid-14th century, a pound of beef cost more than a laborer earned in a day. During bad harvests, meat disappeared entirely from public stalls. Riots followed. One such riot, in Bruges in 1448, began when a cook's apprentice was caught buying salted lamb from a traveling merchant during a church fast. A city official tried to confiscate the meat. The boy resisted. A crowd formed. Someone threw a bone. Within minutes, meat vendors were being attacked, stalls overturned, and several accused clergy fled the square. The meat was gone, the riot quashed, but the tension never left. In noble kitchens, these fears created paranoia. Stewards began inspecting dishes themselves. Some had books where each cut of meat was recorded, weighed before and after cooking. Kitchen maids were frisked on exit. Pantries were locked. Some cooks began hiding meat bones beneath vegetable peelings to avoid accusations. Others simply stopped cooking anything rich during fast periods, fearing the consequences. And still, the contradiction persisted. While peasants were jailed for trapping rabbits, nobles hunted deer in private forests and dined on songbirds. While commoners boiled leeks and barley, lords paid poets to write verses about roasted crane. The law declared fasting a virtue. The elite made it a performance. Meat, in this world, was more than sustenance. It was a ladder, a line, a wall. And cooks were forced to enforce that wall with cleavers, ladles, and silence. Their hands prepared the flesh. Their eyes watched the division. Their souls carried the burden. Because behind every roast at the high table, there was a cook who knew which family starved outside the gate and who would be punished for sharing one bite too many. Chapter 8, Segment 1, Kitchen Alchemy, Fake Food and Edible Illusions. In the medieval world, the feast was never just a meal, it was theater, and the kitchen was its stage. When nobles dined, they didn't want sustenance. They wanted spectacle. The food had to astonish, to deceive, to sparkle with wealth and imagination. It had to impress visiting dignitaries, terrify rivals, seduce lovers, and reflect the divine order of the universe, all on a plate. And so the cook, low-born and smoke-stained, was forced to become something far more than a laborer. He became an alchemist. Welcome back to The Drowsy Historian, where tonight we explore the strange and fascinating world of culinary illusion, a realm where pies sang, roasts walked, and the line between truth and trickery disappeared beneath a golden glaze. To understand how food became illusion, we must first look at the expectations of the medieval elite. Nobles didn't just want to eat, they wanted to eat better than everyone else. And better didn't mean tastier. It meant more extravagant, more unusual, more difficult to prepare. Eating a roast pig wasn't enough. It had to be a pig stuffed with ducks, which were stuffed with quail, which were packed with grapes, eggs, and almond paste. A dish like this was called a roast within a roast, and it wasn't just gluttony, it was a display of wealth and dominance. Only those with vast resources could afford to waste this much food to create something so structurally absurd. Cooks were forced to meet these expectations not with better ingredients, but with better illusions. They created alchemical dishes, foods transformed so completely that they barely resembled what they truly were. Take, for example, the legendary cockatrice, a creature that never existed in nature but was frequently found at high feasts. It was made by stitching the front half of a piglet to the rear half of a goose or capon, sewing them together and roasting the combined beast until the skin crisped into an unholy union. Sometimes its beak was gilded with gold leaf. Other times, the feathers were replaced after cooking to give the illusion that it was still alive. Served whole, this monstrosity was meant to stun the guests, often placed at the center of the table like a trophy. Then there were the pies. Oh, the pies. These weren't the humble fruit pastries you might imagine. These were feats of engineering. Pies shaped like castles, topped with battlements made of sugar-crusted dough. Pies that exploded with live animals, frogs, even rodents that were placed inside after baking. The crust carefully reassembled to conceal the trick. When cut open at the table, the creatures would leap out, causing shrieks, laughter, and sometimes chaos. These weren't jokes. They were carefully planned pieces of performance, practiced by the kitchen in advance, timed with the servants' procession. How were these illusions made? Through a combination of culinary skill and near impossible patience. Doughs had to be shaped with mold or hand-carved. Sugar, a rare and costly commodity, was boiled into paste, then pressed into sculptures, swan necks, archways, even miniature knights. Meat had to be boned, flattened, restructured, and sewn back together. Glazes were made from egg yolks, saffron, and even crushed insects to give rich color. And all of this had to be timed with military precision. But why such effort? Because a noble's power was judged not only by his land or army, but by his ability to host. A successful banquet could forge alliances, intimidate enemies, impress the church, and even convince commoners that their lord was favored by heaven. Illusionary food dishes that defied belief was used to prove that the noble lived beyond the natural world. If he could feast on impossible birds, glowing sauces, or pies that sang, surely he must be chosen by God. The cook then became a creator of miracles. One surviving manuscript from 5th-10th century England describes how to make meat that bleeds gold. The instructions involve boiling beef until soft, injecting it with a mixture of honey, wine, and saffron-colored powder, then chilling it until the juice is congealed. When sliced, the meat would leak shimmering liquid golden, sweet, and sticky. The illusion was so convincing that it was said to have caused a visiting bishop to faint, believing it a divine sign. In truth, it was just trickery. But in a world ruled by symbols, the cook's sleight of hand mattered more than the facts. There were also foods designed to sound strange. Roasted birds stuffed with chestnuts and stones that clattered inside. Minced meat packed into animal bladders and inflated before cooking, which hissed and popped as they roasted. The feast became a concert, orchestrated by the kitchen. Yet these illusions came at a price. They were labor-intensive, dangerous, and often wasteful. One mistake in timing, a pie crust cracking, a glaze melting too early, a bird dying before release, and the entire show was ruined. The cook faced ridicule or punishment. Nobles expected perfection, and a failed illusion wasn't just embarrassing, it was offensive. Worse still was the risk to those performing the trick. Kitchen boys tasked with placing animals inside pies were sometimes bitten or scratched. There are mentions of servants losing fingers while resetting skewers into reassembled roasts. Sugar sculptures were flammable, and on more than one occasion, entire feast tables caught fire due to misplaced candles and too dry sugar paste. And the reward for all this effort? Almost nothing. The nobles clapped, the guests gasped, but the cook remained invisible. If praised at all, it was through the steward. If criticized, it was directly. The pie was late, the bird was cold, the spectacle uninspired. For every moment of applause, there were hours of blistered hands and burned fingertips. Some cooks rebelled quietly. They began embedding messages in their food. One English recipe book includes a footnote about the subtle message, where a pie's filling could be arranged in layers to spell initials. Others carved insulting phrases into the underside of sugar decorations, knowing no one would see them. In a few rare cases, disgruntled cooks designed elaborate failures on purpose birds, too wild, sculptures too unstable, creating chaos under the guise of ambition. These were dangerous acts. But they were the only language of protest the cook could use. And so the kitchen became a hall of mirrors, glittering, mysterious, and brutally demanding. Nobles consumed illusions to feed their pride. Guests applauded what they didn't understand. And cooks, hidden behind their ovens, bent reality dish by dish. The illusionary feast was a marvel but behind every glittering centerpiece, every bird that belched fire or pie that sang, there was a cook gambling with his life. Tonight, we continue through the theatrical, dangerous world of culinary deception in the Middle Ages, where the wrong glaze, a collapsed cake, or a failed spectacle could end not just a career, but a life. Let's begin with the food itself, those surreal dishes preserved in the margins of old manuscripts. One such book, The Form of Curie, compiled by the master cooks of King Richard II's court, offers dozens of recipes designed not to nourish but to bewilder. Take, for instance, the faux hedgehog, a ball of minced pork and breadcrumbs, rolled into a cone, covered in almond paste, and studded with blanched almond slivers to imitate spines. Once browned in the oven and served with a honey sauce, It was said to delight the eye and baffle the guest. Another dish, leche lumbered, was a gelatinous slab of layered meat and dates, dyed with herbs and cut into squares, served cold to imitate stained glass. It was called sweetmeat mosaic, but while some illusions delighted, others turned nightmarish. A letter from a monk in Lincolnshire dated 1419 describes a noble feast gone awry when a sugar sculpture of a cathedral, intended to collapse in staged splendor as part of a final course, crumbled too early. The nobles mistook it as a sign and omen of divine displeasure. The cook, a man named Giles, was dragged before the steward and accused of sorcery. He was stripped of his position and forced to leave town. The collapse had nothing to do with witchcraft. It was a humid night, and the sugar had absorbed moisture, but in a world ruled by superstition, no one wanted to hear chemistry. Some feasts grew so large and the illusions so complex that failure was inevitable. In 1386, at a wedding banquet hosted by the Duke of Anjou, the centerpiece dish was to be a castle siege, an edible sugar fortress attacked by swan-shaped pastries on rolling platforms, followed by a final wave of firecrackers. The timing had to be perfect, but the embers caught early. The sugar walls ignited. What was meant to be a spectacle became a disaster. Guests fled. A servant was burned. The cook was not punished publicly, but according to a steward's account, he was found dead by suicide 2 weeks later, a failed letter of apology clutched in one hand. These weren't isolated tragedies. The cost of failure in illusionary food was higher than most imagine. Because illusion wasn't just novelty, it was reputation. Nobles who felt embarrassed in front of guests blamed the cook. If the feast failed, it meant weakness, and weakness could destroy a family's standing. One noblewoman in Flanders had a cook imprisoned after her father-in-law criticized her banquet's lack of innovation. She never forgave the embarrassment. The cook, according to records, was released after 6 months missing 2 fingers for theft and insult. Even the ingredients themselves posed risks. Gold leaf, a favorite for decoration, was edible in trace amounts, but often applied too thickly. Guests occasionally fell ill from ingesting too much, and though the effect was likely more metallic than mortal, the suspicion always fell back on the kitchen. Saffron, used to dye rice and sauces yellow, was staggeringly expensive and dangerous to misuse. Over-saffron dishes weren't just costly, they were seen as vulgar. A cook in Siena was flogged in 1403 for rendering the noble table too yellow. And yet, these illusions were demanded again and again. No feast could be simple. Nobles vied with one another to produce the most impressive spread. Royal courts, in particular, turned to food as a diplomatic weapon. When King Charles VI of France hosted foreign dignitaries in 1390, his kitchen produced a swan served on a silver mirror, its wings spread wide, soaked in rosewater and lit with candles inside its ribcage. The message was clear. France was rich, mystical, and untouchable. How was such food stored, transported, and served without ruin? The answer: barely. Servants rehearsed dish presentation. Courses were timed like battles. Scaffolds were built to move sculptures from the kitchen to the dining hall without damage. Ice was used rarely available only in winter, but creative cooling methods were developed. Wet cloths, clay boxes, underground chambers. Cooks became engineers, logistics experts. And when the night arrived, performers hiding behind the curtain. Occasionally, the illusions crossed into the macabre. A documented banquet for a Hungarian noble in 1412 featured a dessert shaped like a battlefield, made of candied earth. Sugar soldiers and trenches filled with cherry sauce. The noble reportedly laughed so hard he choked on a marzipan cannonball. He survived, but the kitchen staff was reprimanded for making the scene too realistic. This style of food magic culinary alchemy eventually faded as Renaissance taste changed. But in the high medieval period, it was the height of sophistication. A nobleman's success could rise or fall on a pie with birds inside. A cook could live or die by the tightness of a sugar rose. And every banquet was a gamble, an edible illusion teetering on the edge of chaos. Yet even in the most dazzling moments, the cook was never the star. His name was rarely known. his work devoured then forgotten. And the danger of discovery, the constant fear that the illusion would fail, was his alone. So next time you imagine a medieval feast, don't picture just the candles, the gold, or the glistening meats. Picture the trembling hands behind the curtain. The cook, skin burned from the oven, eyes bloodshot from stress, breath held as the dish is carried forth. Because for him, the magic wasn't just food, it was survival. Chapter 9, Segment 1. Starved for skill. Why most cooks were untrained and disposable. In the flickering shadows of the medieval kitchen, between the sweating potboys, the sharp-eyed stewards, and the crackling fire stood a figure so vital, so central to every feast, and yet so forgotten in the hierarchy that his name was often never recorded. The cook. But not the master cook, mind you, the polished culinary artist of a noble court. No, tonight on The Drowsy Historian, we turn our attention to the vast majority of cooks who toiled in obscurity, untrained, exhausted, and disposable. Because while a handful of elite chefs cooked for kings and bishops, the vast machinery of medieval food service was powered by men, and occasionally women who had no formal education, no apprenticeships, and no protection. They learned their craft not through recipe books or mentorship, but through burns, blisters, and fear. Let us begin by dismissing a modern myth that medieval kitchens were filled with trained professionals carefully composing dishes like modern chefs. In reality, most cooks were servants first, laborers second, and culinarians only by necessity. The vast majority were illiterate. Many didn't know the names of half the ingredients they used. What they knew, they learned by repetition, by watching the man in front of them stir the pot, and by doing exactly the same until it became muscle memory. There were no formal culinary schools. Even guilds, which did emerge in urban centers like Paris and London by the 14th century, were slow to recognize cooks as a professional class. Butchers, bakers, vintners, and pie makers could eventually claim guild status. Cooks, only the very best. The rest remained nameless. Kitchen work was lumped into domestic service, often alongside stable hands, washerwomen, and porters, and the job turnover? Astronomical. A noble's kitchen might cycle through dozens of cooks and assistants every year. If a cook failed to please the steward, or if the noble's child took ill and the meal was blamed, or if the bread came out too hard on the wrong day, dismissal was immediate. No warning, no severance, just gone. In some cases, the cook was driven from the household by guards, sometimes still wearing his apron. This disposability bred a particular kind of fear among cooks. Every dish they prepared could be their last. Every misstep, a half-salted stew, a soup served tepid, a roasted bird too dry, was a potential end to their livelihood. And for many, that meant starvation. They didn't return home. They lived in the kitchens or in small, cold rooms nearby. Losing their position wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a return to beggary. Training, then, was erratic at best. A senior cook might take a younger boy under his wing, show him how to bone a fish or dress a goose, but just as often, the elder saw the newcomer as a threat. Knowledge was hoarded. Why teach someone who might replace you next week? In such a volatile system, keeping secrets was a form of self-preservation. This lack of training also meant that many cooks relied heavily on instinct and guesswork. Temperatures were not measured. They were felt with the hand or guessed by flame color. Measurements were done by eye, or as much as the bowl will hold. Recipes, if they existed at all, were passed orally and varied wildly. A dish served at one noble's table could taste entirely different at another's, depending not on preference, but on a cook's memory and whatever ingredients had survived in storage. And because ingredients were inconsistent, so was the food. Flour might be too coarse. Butter could be rancid. Spices often adulterated. Salt was precious, and meat frequently spoiled. The untrained cook had to improvise, constantly masking smells, thickening sauces with crumbs or ashes, making substitutions without notice. Failure to adapt meant failure to survive. But perhaps worse than the lack of skill was the lack of status. The cook had no voice in the household. He didn't dine with the family. He didn't speak in the great hall. He couldn't read the prayers inscribed in the dining chamber. He was summoned when needed, and forgotten the moment the plate was cleared. Some stewards didn't even learn their cooks' names. They were known by function: the fishman, the meat stirrer, the ladle hand. Even in city taverns and merchant kitchens, where cooks might earn coin rather than food and board, their position was precarious. A tavern cook who failed to attract repeat customers could be replaced overnight. One who used too much spice or too little salt could find himself tossed into the alley. City records from Cologne, Ghent, and York include dozens of complaints about tavern cooks: unwholesome broth, spoiled mutton, burnt cake, bread like stones. Few of these complaints list the cook's name. They didn't matter. And for women, it was worse still. Female cooks were common in smaller households and religious communities, but they faced even more discrimination. Seen as caretakers rather than artisans, their work was dismissed as domestic labor, not craft. Even when they fed dozens of people, managed pantries, preserved food for winter, and prepared medicine alongside meals, they were rarely paid. Their skill was acknowledged, seen as natural, not learned. And if a noble household did employ a woman in the kitchen, it was usually in the most grueling roles: tending the hearth, scrubbing pots, fetching water. Very few ever rose to authority. Yet despite the lack of training, respect, or security, some cooks developed remarkable skills. They learned to smell a sour wine before uncorking, to hear the difference in a boiling pot between ready and ruined, to touch a loaf and know its moisture. These weren't taught in books. They were earned through pain, through burns, through poverty, and some made it. A small number of cooks did rise to prominence. A gifted cook could catch the attention of a noblewoman, impress a steward, or be recommended to a higher household. From there, he might secure better wages or even a small staff. The very best were immortalized in fragments of record names like Tailvant, Mater Tricourt, Martino de Como. But these men were exceptions. Their lives were recorded because they fed kings. Everyone else, thousands of them, remained anonymous, forgotten, their work swallowed, their names erased, their recipes lost. The story of the medieval cook is a story of survival against a backdrop of chaos, not just of the kitchen, but of the world itself. Because even in their endless labor, cooks were not insulated from the great disasters that shaped the Middle Ages: war, famine, and plague. These crises didn't just empty fields and darken cities. They drained kitchens of stability, experience, and the chance to ever develop anything resembling professional skill. In this segment, we explore how cooks were tossed about by these forces, and why most never had the chance to become anything more than desperate, transient labor. Let's begin with war. Feudal Europe was constantly embroiled in conflict. From local skirmishes between rival lords to massive events like the 100 Years' War, violence was an ever-present fact of life. When a region was under siege or in rebellion, the noble kitchen was one of the first places affected. Why? Because it relied on a fragile chain of supply: salt from the coast, meat from distant farms, spices from foreign merchants. One broken road, one sacked village, and the ingredients vanished. The pantry went empty. And so did the cook's usefulness. Noble households on the move, whether traveling to avoid danger or to pursue battle-needed food prepared under extreme conditions. Cooks were forced to improvise with mobile hearths, slaughter animals on the road, cook in open fields with whatever wood could be found. They slept in tents, cooked in rain or snow, and bore the brunt of every delay or shortage. If the food turned out poorly, it wasn't the lord's poor planning that was blamed. It was the cook's incompetence. And when castles fell or families fled, the cook was left behind. Few lords bothered to bring their entire kitchen staff into exile. Most cooks found themselves locked out, dismissed without compensation, or forced to seek work in unfamiliar towns where they were viewed as untrustworthy outsiders. Some were conscripted into armies as field cooks, positions barely above common soldiers, expected to feed hundreds with next to nothing. Others were left to beg. Then came famine. The Great Famine of 1315-17 and other local shortages throughout the 14th century devastated kitchens. Ingredients were suddenly unavailable or too expensive. Bread was stretched with sawdust or mashed beans, Meat disappeared almost entirely. Dairy spoiled fast, and spices were hoarded or stolen. The cook became less a maker of meals and more a magician of scarcity. How do you feed 40 servants with 2 turnips and a cup of grain? How do you boil water when there's no firewood left in the village? Cooks tried everything: fermenting, drying, stretching leftovers into broths that were barely liquid. But the noble class still expected dignity at the table. They demanded real food, not peasant mush. So cooks disguised famine dishes with what little they had: onions browned in ashes, barley porridge flavored with stale ale, sour milk beaten with herbs. When this failed to satisfy, the nobles turned to blame. A nobleman whose wife died of Mount looked to the kitchen for revenge. And again, it was the cook who paid. During famine, wages dropped. Households shrank. Many cooks were replaced by cheaper, younger workers, boys pulled from orphanages or farms, desperate for shelter. These replacements knew nothing of cooking. They learned, if at all, by panic. Burn the stew, beaten, undercooked the fowl, fired. There was no time for mentorship. Famine made experience irrelevant. What mattered was obedience, not knowledge. And then, worst of all, came plague. The Black Death arrived in 1347 and swept across Europe like wildfire. It didn't just kill, it shattered every structure of society, and kitchens were no exception. Household records from manors in Italy, France, and England show massive losses among domestic workers, including cooks. In some towns, the entire kitchen staff died within a week. Those who survived were thrust into sudden importance not because of their skill, but because they were the last ones breathing. This briefly improved their value. With so many dead, wages for cooks skyrocketed. Nobles desperate to maintain their tables paid exorbitant sums for anyone who could roast meat or bake bread. A scullery boy who had once scrubbed pots might suddenly find himself in charge of an entire kitchen without ever having learned how to manage staff. Ration ingredients or time of banquet, disaster created opportunity, but not training. The skill gap widened. Burnt food became common. Mistakes multiplied. And into this void came fraud. Untrained cooks lied about their experience. They claimed to have served bishops, princes, abbots. With no written records or resumes, anyone could pretend to be a master chef until the food hit the table. The noble would rage, the steward would dismiss, and another desperate soul would step forward to fill the same shoes. A dangerous loop where experience was never cultivated, only performed, then punished. In city kitchens, especially in places like Bruges, Ghent, and Florence, the problem became so rampant that cookhouses began posting their menus publicly to reassure customers. Meat cooked by the hand of a proven man, one sign read in 1382. But who defined proven? No one. The cooks rotated weekly. By the time a complaint could be made, the culprit was gone. And there was no refuge in monasteries. While monks often grew their own food and trained novices in cooking, even religious kitchens were overwhelmed during plague and famine. Some monasteries recorded more deaths among their cooks than among their scribes. Others began hiring secular workers to feed the brethren men and women from surrounding villages who had never touched a ladle before but needed coin. The result? Chaos in the refectories. Complaints of bland stews, undercooked bread, and foul-smelling fish appear even in abbey records. This constant turnover meant that the idea of culinary tradition barely existed outside the grandest courts. Recipes were lost. Techniques faded. There was no lineage, no apprenticeship, no gradual refinement, just survival. A cook might learn how to prepare a dish once, under stress, and never repeat it again. Every kitchen was a reboot. Every meal, a risk. And yet, through all this war, famine, plague, fire cooks kept going. Because someone had to feed the table. Someone had to stoke the fire. Someone had to turn hunger into something that resembled food, even if it tasted of ashes, fear, and fatigue. They worked with what they had, not just in terms of ingredients, but in time, strength, memory, and hope. They didn't leave behind cookbooks. They left behind scars, secondhand stories, and a legacy that only modern historians are just beginning to unearth. So, when you think of the medieval cook, don't picture a rotund man with a chef's hat and fine tools. Picture a thin, soot-covered figure standing alone beside a dying fire. A pot of sour barley boiling in smoke, a ladle in hand, and no idea he'll still have a job tomorrow. Chapter 10. Kitchen Spies. How cooks became pawns in noble intrigue. In the world of medieval politics, nothing was sacred, not the church, not marriage, and certainly not the kitchen. Behind every grand banquet, every warm bowl of stew, and every cup of sweet wine, there existed not just food, but information. Secrets slipped between ladles. Eyes lingered too long. Voices carried through stone corridors. And at the center of it all stood the one person who touched every plate, passed through every chamber, and heard every word without ever being seen. The cook. Tonight on The Drowsy Historian, we explore the secret lives of medieval kitchen staff, the silent observers who became informants, intermediaries, and sometimes unwilling pawns in the deadly game of noble intrigue. At first glance, the cook might seem like the last person anyone would trust with a secret. Grimy from the hearth, sleeves rolled up, surrounded by hanging carcasses and bubbling pots. But that's precisely why he was so useful. No one suspected the cook. No one watched the kitchen closely unless something had already gone wrong. The nobility believed the kitchen existed to serve, not to listen. That arrogance became a blind spot, and it was one that clever men and women quickly exploited. Let's start with one of the simplest methods, the overheard conversation. The architecture of many castles placed the kitchen just beneath or behind the great hall. Thin walls and open vents allowed heat and voices to pass easily between them. Servants preparing food for a feast might hear arguments between noble guests, murmured plans, or even the whispered complaints of a scheming relative. A cook stirring broth beneath the rafters might know more about a marriage alliance than the steward who sat beside the lord. And once that cook knew something useful, someone always wanted to buy it. Courtiers, messengers, foreign agents, they knew the kitchen was a fertile ground for gossip. Many nobles sent trusted aides to befriend kitchen staff. They delivered bribes in the form of silver rings, cured meats, or promises of protection. Sometimes it was gold. More often, it was protection from punishment. Tell me what you hear, and the next time you burn a goose, no one will lay a hand on you. For a terrified cook with no job security, the deal was too tempting to ignore. These kitchen spies weren't always voluntary. In many cases, they were planted. Disguised servants would be hired under false names and slip into kitchen roles, watching, listening, reporting back to rivals. In a French noble house in the 1370s, a pie baker named Gerard was discovered to be a former clerk who had falsified references to enter the kitchen of a wealthy duke. He wasn't there to bake. He was there to gather information on troop movements and trade agreements discussed over dinner. By the time he was found out, he had been inside the kitchen for 8 months. Even trusted, long-serving cooks could be compromised. Some were blackmailed. Others were manipulated by promises of advancement or debt forgiveness. A desperate cook who owed coin to a moneylender could be easily turned. Deliver a note. Poison a goblet. Say nothing when a certain servant is seen sneaking into the pantry at midnight. The work didn't need to be flashy. In the game of medieval politics, silence was often more valuable than action. And sometimes the cook wasn't a spy, he was the message bearer. Letters were smuggled inside pies. Instructions hidden beneath loaves of bread or stitched into the hems of aprons. A roasted capon might be hollowed and filled with folded parchment, sealed in fat, and sent to a castle as a gift. The recipient would cut open the bird, retrieve the message, and eat the rest, leaving no evidence. These culinary couriers were especially useful during sieges, when official messengers were blocked or killed on sight. One kitchen servant in the 1420s reportedly delivered more than a dozen messages between 2 enemy courts, all by baking them into the crusts of meat pies. The kitchen itself, always full of people, became an ideal place to hide in plain sight. Planners of intrigue would meet near the ovens, pretending to discuss spice inventories or wine cellars, one hand on a ladle, the other passing a note. A warning whispered while preparing garlic. A threat folded inside a flour sack. Everyone assumed the cook's chatter was idle gossip. No one expected a coup to start with a cinnamon roll. There are darker stories, too. A cook in Navarre was executed after it was discovered that he had placed a listening hole behind the hearth of a noble's private chamber. Using a series of pots stacked near the opening, he could hear everything said behind the wall. For months, he passed the secrets to a rival household. When discovered, he was tied to the very spit he once turned and burned alive. In Milan, a kitchen assistant confessed under torture to having delivered a poison syrup to a noble's mistress, not because he wanted to, but because her rival had threatened to frame him for theft if he refused. He had no loyalty in the affair, just fear. His testimony revealed a web of manipulation so deep that 5 other household members were implicated, including a stable boy and a laundry maid. All were hanged. None were nobles. Because that was the other cruel reality. While nobles played their games, it was always the servants who paid the price. When secrets spilled, the fingers pointed downward. Rarely was the Lord blamed. Instead, the cook became the villain. The one who must have known. The one who let it happen. Even when innocent, the kitchen became a place of suspicion. Servants were interrogated. Inventories searched. Stewards turned hostile. Trust disappeared. Some households went so far as to rebuild their kitchens, entirely moving them away from the main hall, closing vents, and sealing windows. The goal was not to prevent food from burning, it was to keep secrets from leaking. But no amount of stone could silence the kitchen entirely. Because even as walls were raised, the cooks remained close. They delivered the food, cleaned the platters, walked the corridors between chambers. They saw everything, who ate together, who drank alone, who refused the venison, and who left the wine untouched. A good cook could guess a man's temperament from his appetite. A better one could tell when a noblewoman had been crying, even if her face was powdered and her voice steady. They noticed, and if they chose to speak even in whispers, they could shift the power in a household without ever drawing a blade. In the tight, smoky heat of a medieval kitchen, you might not expect history to pivot, but it did, and often. Cooks, long dismissed as menials, sometimes held the key to loyalty, betrayal, even war, because while nobles feasted and plotted, it was the cooks who fed them, observed them, and in a few remarkable cases, tipped the scales of power in ways the nobles never saw coming until it was too late. Let's begin with one of the most famous culinary betrayals in English history. In the year 1326, Queen Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, launched a rebellion against her husband with the help of her lover, Roger Mortimer. The court was chaotic, spies were everywhere, and the king's household had grown paranoid. One account, passed down by chroniclers and embellished by later historians, tells of a cook in the king's retinue who secretly passed information to the queen's camp. The cook, only ever referred to as Gerald the fireman, was said to have overheard royal plans for a secret departure and relayed them through a chain of kitchen boys and innkeepers, disguised as routine food deliveries. The message reached Mortimer in time to intercept the king's flight, leading to Edward's capture and eventual deposition. Whether the cook survived the aftermath is unknown, but the event remains one of the earliest links between the kitchen and royal downfall. Sometimes the cook's power came not from betrayal, but from silent resistance. In one castle near Bruges, during a succession crisis in the mid-14th century, the aging lord began favoring his youngest son over the elder. The court whispered of legitimacy, bribery, and secret deals. The household split into factions. According to an obscure local account, the kitchen staff sided with the elder son, not by open declaration, but through carefully timed sabotage. Meals for the younger were cold. His wine was soured, his pastries undercooked, his guests served last. These were minor slights plausibly explained, but they accumulated. The younger son complained to his father, who dismissed it as paranoia. But the guests noticed. The subtle disrespect bred doubt. And in a society obsessed with order and divine favor, the sense that the wrong son was not blessed by his household cast a long shadow. Eventually the younger withdrew, fearing for his life, the elder inherited the estate. The cooks, they returned to normal as if nothing had happened. Of course, not every kitchen story ended quietly. In 1411, a royal banquet in Aragon descended into panic after a nobleman collapsed mid-feast, foaming at the mouth. Poison was immediately suspected. The cook, an older man named Esteban, who had served for over 20 years, was dragged from the kitchen and tortured. He denied everything. But the truth emerged weeks later. The nobleman had been poisoned not by Esteban, but by a rival lord squire who had bribed a wine server to switch goblets. Esteban was released, but permanently maimed by the torture. What he did next became legend. Rather than leave quietly, Esteban stayed. He fed the court as he always had, but his dishes became darkly symbolic. He served black bread shaped like skulls, blood sausages, spiced to bitterness, and pies filled with bitter herbs. When asked about his choices, he said, "Only I cook what suits the taste of the court." Eventually, even the king noticed. Esteban was dismissed, but not before the court understood his message. In a world where guilt was assumed, even a cook could remind them of the taste of injustice. The kitchen also served as a hiding place, not just for secrets, but for people. During the War of the Roses, when allegiances turned on a whim, several nobles and their children were smuggled out of castles through kitchen passages. Kitchens often connected to servant corridors, waste chutes, or discreet exits used for bringing in firewood or discarding refuse. One notable escape involved a young noble woman disguised in a cook's tunic, her face smeared with soot, flipping past guards while carrying a pot of stew. She made it across enemy lines and later became a key figure in negotiating a truce. Her escort, a real cook who agreed to help, risking execution if caught. He was never named in official records, but was remembered in family letters as the ghost of the hearth. Then there were the cooks who never had a choice. Pressured by rival factions within the household, they were forced to carry poisoned meals or deliver notes they didn't understand. One case from a Venetian noble family in the late 1400s describes a cook who unwittingly passed along what he thought was a shopping list, tucked in a bundle of herbs. It turned out to be a kill order. When it was intercepted, the cook was tried as a conspirator. His hands were crushed, rendering him unable to work. He was later exiled, despite evidence that he'd been entirely unaware of the plot. In the eyes of the powerful, ignorance was no defense. A cook touched too many things. He was either useful or dangerous. But in the end, not all kitchen intrigue was born of malice. Sometimes it saved lives. In 1384, in a castle near Rouen, a young kitchen maid overheard a plot to assassinate the visiting bishop by slipping poison into his sweet wine. She risked everything to speak to the steward, who dismissed her. Unwilling to give up, she poured out the wine and replaced it with water. When the bishop arrived, he tasted the drink and recoiled. "Who dare serve me water at a noble table?" he roared. But the maid stood silent. The kitchen bore the shame. The bishop lived. Days later, the wine was tested with a dog, who died instantly. The bishop granted the maid a pension. She disappeared from record soon after, her name possibly changed for her own protection. These stories remind us that the cook's world wasn't just one of toil and technique. It was a theater of quiet power. The kitchen may have been lowly in rank, but it's at the crossroads of trust, access, and discretion. A good cook fed his lord. A clever cook watched him. A brave cook changed history. So the next time you picture a medieval plot unfolding in a torch-lit hall, imagine too the kitchen just beyond the corridor. A figure wiping his hands on an apron. A pot simmering on the fire. A scroll hidden beneath the onions. A glance shared. A secret kept or whispered. Chapter 11. Boiled Alive. The Brutal Punishments for Culinary Crimes. In the blazing heart of a medieval kitchen, the fire was always close. It roasted meat, boiled water, warmed bread, and, in rare but horrifying moments, served as the instrument of death. Because in the hierarchy of medieval justice, there was no mercy for treachery, especially when it came from within the household, and few acts were seen as more treacherous than crimes committed in the kitchen. Poisoning, theft, sabotage, or even negligence that brought shame to a noble's table. When such acts occurred, punishment was often not just swift, it was spectacularly brutal. Tonight on The Drowsy Historian, we enter the terrifying world of medieval culinary justice. And we begin not with metaphor, but with a law as literal as it was horrific: boiling. Boiling as a form of capital punishment as one of the darkest legal corners of the late medieval world. While rare compared to hanging or beheading, it was reserved for those crimes considered so foul, so intimate in their betrayal, that a normal death was not enough. One of the most documented examples comes from 1531. During the reign of King Henry VIII, although slightly outside the medieval period, it was rooted in earlier customs. A man named Richard Roos, a cook in the household of Bishop Fisher, was accused of poisoning a pot of porridge intended for the bishop and his guests. 2 people died. Others fell gravely ill. Whether Roos had done so intentionally, or whether it was an accident or even a setup, remains unclear. But Henry VIII made an example of him. He ordered Roos to be boiled alive at Smithfield. Contemporary accounts describe a great cauldron filled with water, placed over a roaring fire. Roos was stripped and lowered into it while still conscious. According to a chronicle, he screamed and thrashed for a prolonged period before dying. The crowd watched in horror and fascination. The law allowing such punishment, passed soon after, was specifically targeted at cooks and others who used poison in the preparation of food or drink. It was never widely applied, but its existence alone cast a long, terrifying shadow over kitchen work. But one need be boiled alive to suffer terribly for kitchen mistakes. Let's journey further back into the 14th century, where records from English and French noble houses show a variety of punishments for cooks and servants who failed their duties, especially when the failure cost their master's dignity or health. Spilled wine on a noble's lap? The servant might be whipped not just once, but ritually, in front of other staff. A burnt meal served to visiting dignitaries? The cook could be fined an entire month's wages, if he even earned coin. In many cases, punishment was in kind. A burnt roast meant the cook's hand was held briefly in flame. An oversalted dish might earn a mouthful of brine poured forcefully in as mockery. These weren't officially sanctioned laws. They were house rules enforced by stewards and guards who had full power to mete out discipline as they saw fit. And then there was public shame. A cook who served rotten food might be paraded through the courtyard, wearing the spoiled meat around his neck. Another might be chained to the kitchen door, forced to ring a bell and shout his crime to all who passed. The aim was not just to punish, it was to remind every other servant of the price of failure. Some households even kept a branded collar, a metal band etched with the words, "Kitchen Fool." That was placed around the necks of those who erred too often. It wasn't worn long, just long enough to break the spirit. In the bustling kitchens of monasteries, punishments were slightly different, but no less severe. Monastic records show that novices assigned to kitchen duty were frequently punished with isolation or food denial. A young monk who overboiled the fish for Lent might be forced to fast for 3 days in a cold chamber. Another who allowed the bread to burn might be publicly rebuked during meals, humiliated in front of his brothers while he served them. Silence was often enforced as punishment. To lose one's voice in a community of prayer and chant was a deep wound, especially when combined with harsh labor. Among city kitchens, things could be even more violent. In the cookhouses of Florence, Ghent, and London, where independent taverns thrived and reputations lived or died on flavor, owners ruled with iron hands. Apprentices who ruined batches of dough might be beaten with rolling pins or kicked into the alley. One report from Bruges describes a tavern cook being branded on the hand with a hot pie tin after stealing cuts of meat. In Paris, several kitchens kept stocks wooden restraints where cooks would be locked, their crimes painted on signs around their necks. And all of this occurred in a time when legal recourse was meaningless to the poor. A cook who protested abuse would be laughed out of court if he even made it there. In most cities, domestic workers were property in all but name. If a noble said the food had been poisoned, that was enough. There was no need for a trial, no investigation, just punishment. Fear crept into every layer of the kitchen. A cook preparing meat for a nobleman with gout might be terrified of using the wrong cut. A young girl tasked with sugaring pastries might use too little, fearing the Lord would accuse her of stinginess, but too much might be labeled wasteful. A single mistake could mean punishment, not only for the individual, but for their family. Some noble houses held servants collectively responsible. If a banquet failed, everyone in the kitchen suffered. But perhaps most terrifying of all were the silent punishments, those not written in laws or records, but whispered in hallways and passed down as legend. A tale from a Bavarian castle speaks of a cook who served an undercooked bird to a foreign ambassador. The diplomat fell ill. Days later, the cook vanished. The official story was that he had run away in shame. But years later, masons renovating the castle reported finding bones in the old wine cellar wrapped in a cook's apron, with a broken ladle beside them. The story may be apocryphal, or it may be one of the many cases where the kitchen served not just food, but as the final resting place of those who failed. The fear of punishment shaped every aspect of a medieval cook's work. It wasn't just about food anymore, it was about survival. Every turn of the spit, every measure of salt, every second a pot boiled unattended, carried the weight of potential violence. Innovation was crushed beneath the fear of failure. And so, rather than develop bold culinary styles or experiment with recipes, most cooks clung desperately to tradition, however flawed, however rudimentary, because one wrong move could lead not just to dismissal, but to death. Let's begin with a telling example from the royal court of Hungary in the 1380s. A young assistant cook named Oleg, barely 15 years old, accidentally dropped a silver ladle into a boiling pot of wine meant for a feast honoring the visiting Bohemian king. He panicked, reached in with his hand, and badly burned himself trying to retrieve it. The burn made him drop the ladle again, and in the process, some ash from the hearth spilled into the pot. When the dish was served, the flavor was bitter and the wine oddly colored. The Bohemian guests found it insulting. Accusations flew, and within the hour, Oleg was seized, tied to a beam in the kitchen, and beaten unconscious by the steward. The boy survived, but was crippled in one arm. He never worked again. No trial, no formal charge, just punishment delivered by rank alone. His story was retold by later servants as a warning. Better to serve water than ruin wine. That simple mistake, ash, and panic was enough to destroy a life. Similar fates awaited many who served nobles with sensitive egos or political enemies. In the tense courts of northern Italy, where city-states warred as much with each other as within, meals were more than nourishment. They were signals of status, allegiance, and control. If the guest of a rival family found his meat undercooked or his bread poorly risen, it could be interpreted not as incompetence, but as insult. Cooks were expected to anticipate these possibilities, and if they failed to impress, they were punished not for bad food, but for failing to uphold the host's honor. In 1419, a banquet in Genoa ended in violence after a minor noble accused the host of deliberate slight. The cause? His bowl of fish stew was served colder than the one given to his rival. The offended guest stormed from the table, and a duel followed the next morning. The cook, despite having served the stew as quickly as possible, was blamed for the escalation. He was thrown into a dungeon for a week and later fined a sum so large it required his family to sell their home, all because of lukewarm broth. But perhaps no crime weighed heavier on a cook than suspicion of poisoning, whether real or imagined. The line between accident and treason was perilously thin in the kitchen. A rotten egg, an improperly stored meat pie, even a too sweet wine could provoke suspicion. And suspicion alone was enough? In the German Principality of Saxony, cooks accused of poisoning were often executed before evidence could be collected. One 1394 case involved a cook named Matthias, who had served under a noble with chronic stomach problems. When the Lord died suddenly during Lent after a meal of stewed apples and soft cheese, Matthias was accused of murder. Despite his protests, he was sentenced to a trial by water. His hands were tied, and he was thrown into the moat. If he sank, he was innocent. If he floated, he was guilty. He floated. Pulled from the water, half drowned, he was hanged within the hour. No investigation was made into the Lord's long-standing illness. To the court, the cook was expendable. Sometimes entire kitchen teams suffered for the actions of one. In France, records from the Chateau du Chinon tell of a pastry banquet gone wrong in 1452. The desserts meant to be lavish sugar. Sculptures collapsed before presentation due to humidity and poor timing. The noble host, embarrassed before foreign dignitaries, ordered the heads of the pastry team shaved and had them paraded in their soiled aprons through the village. Their fingers were painted with molasses to signify their sticky incompetence. Local children were encouraged to throw spoiled fruit at them. While not lethal, the punishment ensured none of them ever worked in a noble kitchen again. Such humiliations were more common than executions, but could be equally devastating in societies where reputation determined survival. Being marked as a failed cook meant exile to the lowest echelons of labor scrubbing floors, mucking stables, or worse, starving in alleys with other outcasts. This ever-present threat had another, subtler effect. It created a culture of silence. If a cook made a mistake, others covered for him not out of camaraderie, but out of fear that exposure would bring collective punishment. If a rat was seen in a pantry, it was ignored. If meat spoiled, it was slathered with herbs. If milk curdled, it was turned into cheese and served anyway. Better to risk illness than a lashing. Better to lie than to lose everything. Innovation was stifled. Why try a new blend of spices if it might offend a noble's taste? Why adjust a baking method if the result could be seen as untraditional? Medieval cuisine remained stuck in patterns not because people lacked creativity, but because the risks of deviation were simply too high. Culinary culture in noble Europe, ironically, became less daring than that of the peasantry, where food necessity bred experimentation with wild greens, preserved fruits, and varied grains. In noble kitchens, the goal was safety, familiarity, control, and always fear. Yet even amid all this darkness, some cooks survived. A lucky few earned reputation so strong that their patrons shielded them from punishment. These rare individuals became culinary celebrities like Guillaume Turel, who served French kings and eventually became head cook of Charles VI. But even Tailvint's early career was littered with close calls and court rumors. For every famous name like his, there were thousands of forgotten cooks buried under ash, beaten into silence, or disappeared into the same pantries they once worked. The cruelty of punishment in medieval kitchens wasn't just a quirk of the times. It was part of a larger system that demanded absolute loyalty, instant obedience, and perfection under impossible conditions. And when those conditions failed to produce it, the cooks bled. So the next time you think of the rich smells wafting from a castle's hearth, think also of the trembling hands stirring the pot, of the eyes cast down to avoid offense, of the bruises hidden beneath sleeves. And remember that the cost of a medieval meal wasn't paid only in coin, it was often paid in fear, pain, and silence. Chapter 12, Fire and Filth. How unsanitary kitchens made everyone sick. In the imagination of most modern minds, a medieval kitchen might evoke hearty stews bubbling in cauldrons, loaves of fresh bread stacked beside a roaring hearth, or meat sizzling over open flames. But strip away the romantic haze, and what remains is something far more disturbing. A space where fire met filth, where animals and humans crowded together, and where nearly every meal carried with it a silent risk of illness, of infestation, even of death. For despite its central role in the household, the medieval kitchen was often one of the most unsanitary places in the entire estate. Tonight on The Drowsy Historian, we descend into the smoke-choked corners of the noble kitchen to discover how the very place meant to nourish also served as a breeding ground for disease, and how its design, habits, and technology, or lack thereof, turned even the best intentions into a health hazard. Let's begin with the environment. Most noble kitchens were detached or semi-detached from the main residence for one reason: fire. A large kitchen filled with open hearths, flaming spits, boiling pots, and wooden beams was a constant fire risk. Many castles and manors lost entire wings to accidental blazes that started in the kitchen. Yet, this separation also created neglect. Kitchen buildings were often placed near stables or animal pens, leading to a steady migration of filth manure on shoes, rats in the grain, flies on the butcher block. And since kitchens were rarely built with drainage in mind, slop water from washing dishes or gutting animals often pooled in corners or was thrown outside the nearest door, attracting more pests and creating a stench that could carry for miles. And then there were the surfaces. Stone counters, where they existed, were rarely scrubbed clean. Wooden tables absorbed blood, wine, and grease. Cleaning was done hastily, if at all. Soap was expensive, water had to be hauled manually, and labor was too scarce to waste on luxuries like hygiene. A quick wipe with a dirty rag sufficed. In busier kitchens, a thick layer of grime known by some as the cook's crust might form across prep areas, with newer spills layering atop the old. The butcher's corridor was particularly nightmarish. Animals were slaughtered on site to ensure freshness, but few kitchens had dedicated drainage or blood traps. Instead, the floor soaked up the fluids. The stench of congealed blood mixed with ash and sweat. Bowls of organs were set aside for sausages or pies, but often sat for hours at room temperature, drawing flies. Meat was hung near fires to ward off rot, but even in cool months, spoilage was common. Maggots were sometimes plucked from carcasses before cooking, and cooks learned to cut around green spots of decay with practiced hands. Then came the water or lack thereof. Fresh. Clean water was difficult to access even in wealthy households. Wells might be distant or polluted. Rainwater cisterns collected dirt, bird droppings, and algae. What water did make it to the kitchen was precious and reused often. A pot used to wash vegetables might then rinse knives or hands. Leftover stew might be thinned with water from the same tub used to soak raw poultry. And boiling wasn't always the safeguard we imagine today. Many kitchens lacked the fuel to keep fires hot enough for long enough to truly sterilize. Soups might bubble, yes, but not always to safe temperatures. Stews were reheated day after day, with new meat or vegetables tossed into old batches, creating festering broths that simmered with bacteria. And let's not forget the people. Kitchen workers themselves were rarely clean. Most owned a single outfit, worn until it fell apart. Hair was uncovered, hands unwashed, nails blackened with soot, skin blistered from the heat, eyes red from smoke. These were the tools that touched every meal. Cooks sweated into sauces, coughed over chopping boards, scratched fleas while turning spits. Children often worked as helpers, running barefoot between messes, occasionally relieving themselves outside the kitchen door. The idea of hygiene, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. Smell was the only real indicator of danger. If something didn't reek, it must be fine. But pathogens don't carry odor, and so disease spread silently. Bread, often considered the safest food, wasn't immune either. Baked in communal ovens or the manor's own bakehouse, it was frequently infested with weevils or mold, especially in damp months. Grain, poorly stored, developed fungus that could cause hallucinations or fatal poisoning, an affliction now understood as ergotism. Known in parts of medieval Europe as St. Anthony's fire, it could cause burning sensations, convulsions, and even gangrene. Entire villages were stricken, and while peasants suffered worst, even noble tables weren't spared. A single loaf of tainted rye could take down a feast. Milk was another hazard. Cows were rarely washed, udders often infected. Milk soured quickly without refrigeration, yet it was used liberally in sauces, pastries, and porridges. Spoiled milk might be masked with honey or spices, but it still carried illness. The same went for eggs gathered by children, unwashed, sometimes cracked or already starting to rot when used. With no concept of salmonella, eggs were added to dishes with abandon, including uncooked batters and sauces. And yet, when illness struck, the kitchen was rarely blamed. Nobles believed sickness came from sin, bad air, or imbalance in the humors, not from the filthy meat pie they'd eaten the night before. This ignorance protected the kitchen from reform. Food could make a lord vomit for 3 days. But blame would fall on a curse or a breeze from the swamp, not the chicken that sat unrefrigerated for 8 hours. When guests died, suspicion might turn to poisoning, but never to hygiene. The truth that most noble kitchens were breeding grounds for disease went largely unnoticed or unspoken. And so the cycle continued. Filth bred sickness. Sickness was blamed on superstition. Kitchens remained unchanged. There were exceptions, of course. Some monasteries maintained stricter hygiene, guided by religious rules of cleanliness. Certain abbeys had wash stations, separate butchery rooms, and even rudimentary ventilation. A few noble households employed stewards obsessed with order, requiring daily cleaning and punishing sloppiness. But these were the rare few. For most of medieval Europe, the kitchen was where food and filth collided. The medieval noble kitchen, boisterous, smoky, chaotic, was not just a factory of food. It was a silent, invisible engine of illness. Despite the wealth poured into its hearths and ingredients, the lack of basic sanitation meant that nearly every dish that emerged from it carried a risk. The results were predictable. Chronic digestive disorders, mysterious fevers, sudden death symptoms that became so common they were seen not as warning signs, but as a normal part of life. In reality, the noble diet was killing the very people it was meant to impress. Let's begin with one of the most misunderstood ailments of the medieval world, dysentery, or the bloody flux, as it was known then. Often blamed on seasonal changes or divine punishment, it was more often caused by contaminated water, spoiled meat, or fecal matter on unwashed hands, precisely the kind of conditions found in every busy kitchen. A noble could be struck down for weeks with cramping, fever, and bloody diarrhea after eating a meal that had sat too long, been handled by infected fingers, or been garnished with herbs rinsed in foul water. But because the correlation wasn't understood, no change was made. Cooks continued using the same filthy buckets. Slaughtered animals were gutted next to pastry dough. Illness remained an unsolved riddle. Beyond dysentery, food poisoning, though not named as such, was rampant. Nobles frequently suffered from sudden vomiting, chills, and convulsions after a meal, and the kitchen trembled each time it happened. In one recorded case from a French estate in 1378, a visiting count fell violently ill after a feast of duck and berry compote. The duck had been stored near a smoky hearth for nearly a day and reheated 3 times. When the count collapsed, the kitchen was sealed and all staff interrogated. Poison was suspected, but no evidence was found. Eventually, it was ruled divine displeasure. The cook was fined a silver coin and sent back to work. Parasites were another frequent visitor to the noble gut. Undercooked pork carried tapeworms. Beef harboring cysts. Wild game crawling with mites. These were rarely noticed in time. Eggs weren't candled or inspected, and milk drawn in the morning. Left warm on the table for hours served as a breeding ground for bacteria. Bread, too, was not immune. As mentioned in segment 1, ergot fungus could infest rye and cause neurological symptoms, convulsions, even death. In the regions of the Rhine Valley, outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire were so common that monks specialized in caring for the afflicted. Noble families were not exempt. Entire courts suffered after feasts prepared with tainted grain. Scurvy, caused by a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, ravaged those in noble households during long winters or war sieges. Despite their wealth, many nobles ate a diet almost entirely lacking in vitamin C, salted meats, bread, cheese, wine, and dried legumes. Fruits were seen as peasant food or reserved for medicinal use. Vegetables were viewed with suspicion, especially raw ones, which were believed to disturb the humors. As a result, nobles developed tooth loss, bleeding gums, joint pain, all while their kitchens overflowed with salted meats and dried pies, but lacked the simplest greens. Worse still were the infestations. Rats roamed freely in kitchens drawn by offal piles and spilled grain. Lice and fleas plagued staff, spreading typhus and other diseases. Storage rooms held sacks of flour that moved if you watched long enough, teeming with weevils or larvae. Spices were sometimes mixed with powdered stones or contaminated with mold. Even honey, one of the few natural preservatives, was not immune to contamination, especially if stored in reused containers or left uncovered near the hearth. And while nobles were frequently sick, they didn't always connect it to food. After all, they ate the same meals daily. They trusted their cooks. They blamed the air, the season, a curse. The truth that their kitchens were making them ill was hidden behind tradition and ignorance. But the toll was obvious if you look closely. Letters from noble households frequently mentioned weak bellies, fits of the stomach, or fevers of the gut. Chronicles report lords confined to bed for weeks after feasts, and even sudden death during meals. The Duke of Berry once blamed the melancholy salt in a sauce for 3 days of agony. The cause? Spoiled anchovies. In England, a noblewoman was found dead beside her chamber pot after a night of vomiting and mad visions, likely ergot poisoning. In many of these cases, the kitchens came under scrutiny, but never improvement. So why wasn't anything done? Partly because of culinary hierarchy. Nobles didn't see the kitchen as a place of learning or reform. It was a workshop one expected to function regardless of condition. Cooks were not scholars. Even master cooks had little knowledge of germ theory or sanitation. Advice, when sought, came from apothecaries or astrologers, not from kitchen staff. When reforms were proposed, they were dismissed as superstition or expense. Clean water required new infrastructure. Better ventilation meant rebuilding. Few nobles saw the cost as worthwhile, especially when blame could be passed on to servants or written off as fate. Another reason was taste. Noble food prized strong flavors: salt, vinegar, cinnamon, cloves, not for refinement, but to mask spoilage. Spices were used to cover sour wine, rank meat, or days-old poultry. Dishes drenched in sauces or stewed for hours could hide a multitude of sins. Guests praised the richness of flavor without realizing they were consuming something just shy of rotting. The consequences were generational. Many nobles grew up with weak stomachs and constant illness. Infirmity was expected. When a young lord vomited after a feast, he was said to have inherited his father's stomach. In reality, he had inherited his kitchen and all its filth. There were exceptions, rare households that attempted to impose rules. Some stewards mandated that raw meat be stored separately from cooked. A few abbeys insisted on boiling water before cooking. In Venice, a physician commissioned by the Doge suggested a plan to renovate kitchens with proper drains and chimneys, but it was never funded. Reform, where it existed, was scattered and short-lived. So, what changed? Only centuries later, with the spread of Enlightenment thinking, the rise of urban sanitation systems, and the first inklings of microbiology, did noble kitchens begin to adapt. But for hundreds of years, the filth remained, disguised by pageantry and spice, killing quietly. Next time you imagine a banquet hall glittering with torches, imagine too the bucket of murky water used to rinse the goblets, the spit boy who hadn't bathed in weeks, the butcher's table crawling with flies just out of sight. This was the true taste of nobility, a mix of pride, privilege, and parasites. Chapter 13, The Spit Boy's Curse, Growing Up in the Kitchen's Lowest Rank. In the searing heat of the medieval kitchen, surrounded by roaring fires and clattering knives, one figure remained mostly invisible, so covered, silent. He had no formal title, no respect, and almost no future. He was the spit boy, a child servant tasked with the exhausting, filthy, and dangerous job of turning the roasting spit by hand. His name rarely appeared in household records. His voice, when heard, was often ignored. And yet, without him, no feast could unfold. He was the lowest of the low, and his life was a test of endurance, poverty, and quiet suffering. Tonight, on The Drowsy Historian, we meet the boy behind the banquet. Not the chef or the steward, but the one with blistered hands and a soot-blackened face, the child who sat closest to the fire, who worked the longest hours, and who often died before reaching adulthood. The spit boy was typically a peasant child sent into service, often between the ages of 7 and 10. If a family owed a debt, or if a father died in war, The child might be handed over to the manor's kitchen as partial payment or simply out of desperation. Some were orphans. Others were born into hereditary kitchen service, their father's stable hands or woodcutters. They arrived barefoot, thin, and silent, and were immediately put to work. His job was simple in theory. Rotate the spit that held whole animals, pigs, boars, lambs, sometimes even entire deer over an open fire, ensuring even cooking. But in practice, it was a grueling test of physical and mental stamina. The fire was enormous, often spanning 6 or more feet, radiating blinding heat. The boy sat on a low stool or stood beside a cranking wheel, arms outstretched, manually turning the iron spit for hours on end. The room filled with smoke and grease. His eyes watered constantly. His hands blistered and bled from the iron's heat and the repetitive motion. He could not leave his post, not to eat, drink, or relieve himself without permission. If he turned too fast, the meat burned. If he turned too slow, it cooked unevenly. If it fell into the fire, he was whipped or, worse, dismissed entirely, cast back into the streets with no family or future. Many spit boys developed burns, coughs, or lung issues before age 12. Some fainted from exhaustion, only to be doused with water and sent back. In larger kitchens, multiple boys might take turns, but in smaller manors, one child often manned the spit alone, from dawn until the feast ended. And there were no safety precautions. The spit mechanism was crude, iron rods balanced over a fire pit, rotated by hand or foot. Grease dripped constantly, spattering onto bare skin. Sparks jumped from the coals. The floor was slippery with fat and ash. More than one spit boy lost his balance and fell into the fire. Others were accidentally stabbed when the roasted beast was hauled off the spit too quickly. Injuries were common, and they were ignored. The child was expected to endure. Some castles offered minimal compensation, a crust of bread, a bit of wine, or a cast-off tunic. But most spit boys slept near the hearth on a ragged mat, curled up beside the dying embers they'd labored over. They awoke coughing, their faces caked in soot, and their service could last for years. In rare cases, a spit boy might be promoted to kitchen help or errand runner, but more often, he aged out of usefulness by 13 or 14, too damaged or stunted for higher tasks. His world was not just physical suffering, it was humiliation. Spit boys were routinely mocked by older servants. Their clothing was often ragged on purpose, signaling their rank. In jest or cruelty, some households made them wear bells or painted aprons. They were forbidden from speaking during service, and if they made noise coughing, sneezing, crying, they were beaten. One account from a Flemish manor describes a boy made to kneel in the ashes for an hour after sneezing during a royal toast. Another was forced to chew hot pepper and rub his eyes after dropping a spit rod. Despite their abuse, spit boys knew everything. They were always present at dawn prep, during secret late-night meals, when nobles wandered down to the kitchen for illicit snacks or hushed conversation. They overheard affairs, financial whispers, and political gossip. They watched cooks steal meat or stewards pocket flour, but no one listened to them. Their status made them invisible. What they knew, they kept quiet, sometimes for survival, sometimes because no one ever asked. And yet, stories of their resilience emerge, hidden between the lines of history. In a surviving letter from a French baron's steward dated 1356, the steward complains of a brazen boy who dared to correct the master cook on turning speed, claiming the hindquarters would crisp before the ribs. Though punished for insolence, the boy was later proven right by the noble's physician, no less. The cook was humiliated, and the boy promoted to fire tender. A tiny victory, perhaps, but a rare one. Another tale from the Burgundian court tells of a spit boy who saved a feast by catching a collapsing ceiling beam during a fire. He suffered a broken arm, but was gifted boots and 2 silver coins, a fortune for a child. He eventually left the kitchen and became a city baker. But for most, escape never came. They remained in the kitchens until used up. Some died young from illness or injury. Others were cast out and joined the roving bands of homeless youth that haunted medieval towns. A few were absorbed into menial labor elsewhere, wood gathering, manure spreading, grave digging. The kitchen gave them only pain and smoke and a name no one remembered. So why did the role persist? Because it was cheap. Because it worked. Because nobles didn't see these children as people, but as tools. And because the medieval system ran not just on wheat and meat, but on labor that never spoke, never broke rank, never mattered. The spit boy was the embodiment of that labor, turning endlessly, sweating silently, forgotten completely. And while the feasts of kings were toasted and praised, somewhere behind the curtain of roasted meat and jellied eels, a small boy turned the spit until his fingers bled. While most spit boys lived and suffered in silence, a few stories survived glimpses into their otherwise undocumented lives, scratched into letters, court records, and even folklore. And in these stories, we find not just cruelty, but defiance. We find children who, against every odd, left some kind of mark. But for every name remembered, 100 more were burned away by fire, forgotten in the smoke and heat of kitchens that never cared for the smallest among them. Let's begin in Devonshire, England, 1398. A manorial court record notes a case of culinary theft involving a spit boy named Elias, age approximately 10. The charge? He had, while turning the Sunday roast, managed to secretly pinch off 3 chunks of pork over several hours, neaking them into a rag hidden beneath his stool. The steward discovered the theft when grease stains were noticed on Elias's tunic. He was brought before the Lord, who ordered a beating. But the household chaplain intervened, pleading that the boy had done so out of starvation. The priest offered to pay restitution in grain. The Lord begrudgingly allowed Elias to remain. That small moment of mercy would echo. Elias went on to become a kitchen assistant, then a baker's apprentice. By 1420, records list an Elias of the Hearth, owning a small pie stall near Exeter. Then there's Marzio, an Italian boy from Florence, recorded in the tax rolls of 1411 as property of the noble Visconti family, yes, property. He was listed as a rotatore, a turner. Local letters described him as mute with a crooked spine, likely from years hunched over the spit. Though unable to speak, Marzio was remembered by a visiting poet who called him the silent shadow who turned the meat that fed tyrants. Marzio died at 15. His name was carved into the kitchen beam, non parlava, non nutriva. He did not speak, but he nourished. A kitchen boy turned martyr in wood. Some spit boys escaped into legend. A tale from rural Brittany tells of a boy named Jules, who, after being whipped for turning too slowly, ran away into the woods with only a crust of bread. Weeks later, a noble feast was ruined when no one could manage the great spitfire without him. Jules had, it turned out, been the only one who understood the gear mechanism, a modification he'd made himself in secret. He was tracked down and begged to return. The story ends with Jules demanding better treatment and a half-day off per week. Was it true? Hard to say. But the tale spread through servant halls as a kind of folk hero story. The clever boy who outwitted his masters. Other stories end less romantically. In a 1437 household record from Rouen, a boy listed only as Petrus was removed from service after falling into the fire pit during a midday meal prep. The note reads plainly, "Deceased in flame." No further details. No burial record. Just another life lost to the inferno that roared at the center of noble consumption. The physical toll of the work left lasting marks. Chronic respiratory problems were common. A spit boy's lungs filled with smoke daily. There was no flue, no proper chimney in most kitchens. Soot collected in the nostrils was swallowed in every breath. Burned, scarred arms and legs. Their eyes were often damaged permanently by the glare of flame and grease. And the repetitive motion cranking the spit, often with both arms or a foot-powered treadle, led to crooked spines, worn joints, and twisted fingers. These were children, after all barely big enough to lift a spit rod, yet expected to function like machines. What made things worse was how utterly unprotected they were. Unlike apprentices in guilds or pages in noble service, spit boys had no patron, no mentor. They belonged to no class and no cause. They were not being trained, they were being used. There was no upward path unless they seized one. A lucky few, as we've seen, made that climb. Most, however, were discarded like ashes, replaced the moment they grew too tall or too weak. One diary from a Scottish household mentions a new spit boy arriving every Michaelmas, as routinely as firewood. We received a new turn boy from the villages. Last year's lad took ill and could not continue. His cough was loud. That was all. A brief note. The end of one life, the beginning of another's labor. Even in death, spit boys rarely warranted names. Yet among the servant class, the role was seen as a curse and a badge. Many elderly kitchen workers began as spit boys and carried the pain of that beginning with them all their lives. Old cooks would sometimes trace their scars by the fire, muttering, "The spit raised me." It was a phrase that meant both origin and injury, a source of pride twisted with bitterness. In some cases, their suffering inspired small acts of rebellion. Spit boys might share food scraps with rats, smear fat on handles to cause clumsiness, or whisper obscene nicknames for nobles while they slept. Tiny flames of resistance, mostly unseen. But for children stripped of dignity, even the smallest defiance mattered. They wrote curses in soot on the hearthstone, hid meat bones in noble bedchambers. Some were caught, of course, but others became legends among kitchen workers, symbols of the injustice endured and the spirit never crushed. And by the late 5th-10th century, changes were brewing. Mechanical innovations, clockwork-driven spit mechanisms, pulley systems powered by dogs or even small water wheels began to replace human spit turners in wealthier homes. These machines weren't widely adopted yet, but they signaled the beginning of the end for the human spit boy. And as Enlightenment thinking slowly crept in, noble households began to re-examine how they treated their laborers, at least in theory. Some began offering rudimentary training to young boys. A few granted rest days. In rare cases, wages. But these were exceptions, not rules. The truth is, for centuries, noble kitchens were built on the backs of forgotten children, nameless, barefoot, and burned. And while the roasted boar earned praise, the hand that turned it was blistered, trembling, and silent. Next time you imagine a medieval banquet, the long tables of bread and meat, the lords laughing, the minstrels playing Look Past the Main Hall, Look to the Hearth. Imagine a boy, 10 years old, knees drawn up, hand on an iron crank, sweat stinging his eyes, mouth shut tight. He is not part of the feast. He is its foundation. In the medieval world, death was never just an ending, it was a performance. For the noble class, it was perhaps the most important one of all. A lord's passing wasn't marked by silence or simplicity. It came with bells, banners, processions, and perhaps most curiously, feasts. Grand, elaborate, indulgent feasts, held not only to honor the dead, but to assert the power of the living. At the very heart of these death rites stood the cook, forced to conjure spectacles of abundance in the shadow of mourning. Today, on The Drowsy Historian, we peel back the black velvet of a noble funeral and uncover the strange rituals of food, grief, and control that defined the medieval elite's final days. The story of a noble's Last Supper often began well before they were dead. In many cases, especially in wealthier courts, death was anticipated, sometimes for weeks or even months. Chronic illness, slow decline, or old age allowed the estate to begin preparations. But even in some cases, cooks were summoned within hours to prepare the funeral banquet. And these meals were not modest. They weren't symbolic. They were gargantuan. Multiple courses, exotic ingredients, sculpted meats, sugar monuments. One would think the dead were being honored with a wedding, not a burial. But food was more than comfort. It was a declaration. A noble's funeral feast declared continuity, that the household still functioned, that wealth endured, and that the deceased left behind a legacy strong enough to throw a banquet while their body still lay cold. In some cases, the dead were present laid out in adjoining room, or even seated upright in ceremonial attire, flanked by candles. One infamous French noblewoman, the dead of plague, was dressed in her finest furs and placed at the head of the feast as her cook served gilded goose and rose-flavored pudding. Guests were required to toast in her honor, while her body slumped further with every passing hour. And still, the kitchen had to run. For the cook, funeral feasts were paradoxical. They demanded both delicacy and excess, speed and precision, grief and grandeur. On short notice, a team of servants had to prepare not just a meal, but a statement. If the deceased had died from illness, especially a bad death like dysentery or fever, the pressure was even greater to shift the narrative. The food had to distract. It had to prove that the family was still blessed, that the estate was still abundant, and that death had not touched the soul of the house too deeply. This often led to absurdity. Cooks were asked to serve dozens of dishes that the dead noble had loved, regardless of practicality. In 1419, the Earl of Wiltshire's cook was ordered to roast 24 swans, a dish the Earl had favored in life. Problem was, it was January. The rivers were frozen. Swan was out of season. The cook sent a boy out to buy geese instead, painted and posed to resemble swans. When the deception was discovered, the cook was fined and whipped at a funeral feast. The irony, apparently, was lost on no one. Sometimes the last meal was served while the noble still clung to life. In households with wealth and time, a dying lord would call for his final dish, a comfort food of sorts. This could range from simple porridge with honey to a decadent spiced wine, thick with cinnamon and nutmeg. One bishop in Italy requested a live eel, grilled and glazed in pomegranate juice, as his final act of earthly indulgence. Another noblewoman asked for a sugared almond cake baked by her childhood nurse, brought in from a nearby village. The kitchen, in these moments, became something more than functional. It became sacred. What one ate before death mattered. It was symbolic. A farewell to flesh. A ritual of flavor and memory. And then came the banquet for the living. Once the body was washed and prepared, the feast began. These funeral meals, called mortuary feasts, varied widely depending on region and rank, but they all shared common traits: conspicuous consumption, display of wealth, and political theater. Tables groaned under the weight of roast meats, beef, boar, venison, even peacock, feathers reattached for effect. Bread was baked in the shape of skulls. Meat pies bore the family crest. Some feasts featured dishes with symbolic meaning: fish for resurrection, lamb for sacrifice, wine for blood. In one German noble household, black sausages dyed with ash were served alongside white cheese to symbolize mourning and purity. Yet the cook had no time for symbolism. They were too busy ensuring nothing spoiled, nothing burned, nothing ran out. Mourning did not lessen expectations. In fact, it heightened them. Guests whispered, compared dishes to past feasts, measured generosity by plate. A stingy funeral could stain a family name for a generation. In York, the son of a deceased baron was mocked in court records for hosting a meal fit for a middling merchant, a public humiliation that cost him marriage prospects. In some traditions, the first course was not touched. It was laid out for the dead. A golden trencher, a goblet of wine, a single loaf. Sometimes it was buried with the body. Other times, the food was consumed by the clergy or distributed to the poor. This symbolic offering served as both piety and propaganda. But for the kitchen, it was just another plate to prepare, arrange, and serve perfectly, knowing no one would ever eat it. And still, things went wrong. Cooks were blamed for cold food, undercooked game, sauces that clotted. One chronicler from Burgundy mentions a funeral where the plum pudding boiled over during prayers, filling the kitchen with thick smoke. The cook, panicked, dumped water into the pot, which splattered a steward in his mourning robes. He retaliated by striking the cook, who fell into the hearth. The meal was delayed, the feast ruined. The dead man's name became a laughingstock, all because a pot of pudding boiled too hard. Despite the pressure, some cooks found strange solace in the ritual of funeral food. It was familiar, focused. The grief of the household was muted by the clarity of the task. Boil, bake, carve, serve. In rare cases, cooks added small personal touches: an herb the deceased loved, a shape carved into crust. One old steward recalled how, during his lord's funeral, the cook cried into the broth and then refused to taste it, saying, "Let it be bitter." So was his last breath. Others were less sentimental. In noble circles, death was a practical affair. Staff turnover followed quickly. Wages shifted. Reassignments came within days. The kitchen was cleaned, the next lord installed, and the cycle resumed. Sometimes a new master brought his own staff. Cooks were dismissed, replaced, forgotten. The same hands that prepared the final feast were no longer welcome at the table, but even after the cooking stopped, the kitchen still haunted the memory of death. Long after the final dish was cleared, servants spoke of the smells, the strong meat, the burned sugar, the pungent wine. The kitchen, warm and frantic on the day of mourning, became cold and still. Pots hung silent, fires died. In that silence, the cook's true burden was revealed, not just to feed the living, but to give meaning to the dead. If a noble's death marked the end of a life, the funeral feast was the opening act of everything that came after inheritance. Ambition, betrayal, and the quiet reshuffling of power. And in this delicate chaos, food wasn't just tribute, it was strategy. Every dish had purpose, and behind it, the cook worked with the precision of a general on a battlefield. Because for all its pomp, a noble's funeral was also a political stage, and the kitchen played a more dangerous role than most ever realized. Let's begin with the most unsettling truth. Funeral feasts were sometimes poisoned. Not often, not always, but enough to cast a long, dark shadow over what should have been mourning. In several court records and ecclesiastical investigations, there are whispers of dishes not quite right, of wine that tasted too sweet, of nobles who fell ill, not days after burying their predecessor, but hours after eating his parting banquet. The chaos of grief was an ideal smokescreen for a final blow. If ever there was a time to remove a rival, silence a witness, or hasten an inheritance, it was when everyone wore black and drank freely. In 1472, in the court of a minor Austrian baron, a cook named Wolfram was accused of lacing a quince glaze with ground belladonna. The intended target was the baron's second son, who had spoken out against the new heir's claim. The poison didn't kill him, but it left him paralyzed for days. Wolfram was found dead in the woods 2 days later, his tongue removed. Whether he was silenced by the heir or killed out of revenge remains unknown. But the dish survived in court records, bitter quince upon roasted stag, never again served. Then there were culinary omens believed signs in food that foretold bad luck or death. Medieval kitchens, especially those rooted in folklore-heavy regions like Brittany or Bavaria, were filled with superstitions. If a roast cracked loudly, it meant unrest in the household. If wine turned cloudy during pouring, someone at the table would not live through the year. And during funeral feasts, if a dish spoiled suddenly, or a loaf collapsed in the oven, the cook might declare, half in jest, the dead is not at peace. More than once, such signs were taken seriously enough to cancel or delay burial. Cooks sometimes manipulated these fears. If a master had died cruel or unloved, subtle acts of culinary protest followed. Salt left out of dishes. Pies burned on purpose. A plate dropped too loudly, echoing like a judgment in the stone hall. These small rebellions were invisible to noble eyes, but understood by every servant present. They were the cook's final word on the man they'd served for years without thanks. But beyond poison and omen, food shaped legacy. The dishes served at a funeral lingered in memory, sometimes longer than the deceased himself. Chronicles often describe meals in vivid detail. At Lord Guy de Montfort's passing, we consumed 15 peacocks, each feathered anew, with tongues of orange. At the Duchess of Aquitaine's funeral, the sugared almonds were dyed violet and served in the shape of her seal. These flourishes were more than decoration. They were propaganda. They told guests, this family is powerful, tasteful, eternal. The cook, knowingly or not, became a sculptor of memory. What they prepared became part of the deceased's story. A noble might be remembered less for his conquests and more for the final feast he hosted. One nobleman, little known in life, became a legend after his funeral boasted a pie so wide 6 geese nested inside, and steam rose from it like holy incense. Truth or not, the tale stuck. The kitchen had created myth, and food became proof of order. At a time when succession could tear families apart, the act of sitting down together, eating from the same trenchers, drinking the same wine, was an assertion of unity. Cooks knew this. They ensured everyone's plate was filled, that no noble received a portion smaller than another. A spilled dish, a delay in serving, a missing spoon, these could be read as slights. In one case from 1433, a cousin of the deceased accused a steward of withholding meat to insult my claim. A duel followed days later. In truth, the cooks were often just overwhelmed, preparing a feast for 200 while grieving staff wailed in the halls, while priests marched through with incense, while the kitchen itself reeked of death. This was no place for perfection. Mistakes happened, but they could cost careers or lives. Interestingly, not all funeral food was for nobles. In some towns, it was tradition to feed the poor in the name of the deceased. These soul loaves, given freely, were meant to speed the journey of the departed through purgatory. Cooks might prepare hundreds of simple breads, fish stews, or pottage sent out in baskets to the local sick and hungry. This was part charity, part public relations. A noble who fed the poor on his death earned goodwill. A family that refused was whispered about for years. One widow, Lady Marjorie of Dunwich, became so infamous for skimping on these alms that beggars cursed her estate nightly for decades. And finally, there were the feasts that never happened. In times of plague, war, or scandal, noble funerals were held in silence. No bells, no guests, no food. Cooks, instead of preparing roasts and pastries, were sent to dig graves or burn linens. One castle cook wrote in 1349, "My pot is empty. My hands carry lime. I do not stir the stew, but the ashes." These quiet, hungry funerals left no recipes, no songs, no memories. Just empty kitchens and forgotten names. When the feast was done, when the guests departed and the body lay in earth, the cook cleaned the hearth one final time. Grease was scraped, pots hung, spices sealed, and in that closing act, the kitchen passed into a new chapter. Perhaps a new lord would arrive. Perhaps the staff would be replaced. But for a moment, the kitchen knew stillness, mourning, the breath between death and legacy. And so ended the cook's role, not just in feeding the living, but in shaping the memory of the dead. Not merely a servant, but a silent architect of history, flavor, and farewell. Thank you for listening to this journey through grease, fire, and forgotten lives. This was why it sucked to be a cook in a medieval noble kitchen and more, brought to you by the drowsy historian. Sleep well, unless you're near the hearth. Thank you for drifting through history with us. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into the past, gently tap subscribe and let the drowsy historian be your guide whenever sleep feels far away. Until next time, rest well, dream deeper, and remember, history is never in a hurry.